She thought she'd die there alone, abandoned 19 years old and 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. The stagecoach had left her in the dust with nothing but broken promises and $3 to her name. Now darkness swallowed the Wyoming prairie whole, and Eleanor Hayes could hear things circling in the night, wild things, hungry things. When the wagon appeared like a ghost through the moonlight, she was already asleep beside her trunk, too exhausted even to pray. The stranger who lifted her didn't ask permission. He simply saved her life. If you're watching this story unfold, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far Eleanor's journey reaches across the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The sun had been merciless. Eleanor Hayes sat perfectly still on her leather trunk, hands folded in her lap like a lady at tea, as if proper posture could somehow dignify the absolute catastrophe her life had become. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, indifferent sea of grass and sage that rolled toward distant mountains she couldn't name. The wind carried the scent of earth and something wild she didn't recognize, and it pulled at the careful pins in her dark hair, loosening strands that stuck to the perspiration on her neck. The stagecoach had disappeared over an hour ago, maybe two. She'd stopped checking her mother's pocket watch because each glance made her chest tighten with something between fury and despair. "Miss Hayes, you'll need to disembark here," the driver had announced, his weathered face showing neither apology nor concern. "Stage won't make it through Copper Ridge with the extra weight. Someone from Promise Creek will fetch you by nightfall." "But we're miles from anywhere," Eleanor had protested, hating how her Philadelphia accent made her sound even more out of place. "Surely you can't just leave me. Got a schedule to keep, miss. Town's expecting mail." He'd already been unloading her trunk and carpet bag, dropping them unceremoniously beside what passed for a trail crossing. "You'll be fine. Stay visible from the road." Then he'd climbed back up, snapped the reins, and left her there with $3 in her reticule, her teaching certificate in her bag, and the growing realization that the frontier didn't care about propriety promises or the carefully laid plans of young women from good families. That had been when the sun was still high. Now it hung low and orange on the western horizon, setting the prairie aflame with gold light that would have been beautiful if Eleanor weren't so terrified. She'd read about the West in newspapers and letters from the Wyoming Territorial Education Board that made teaching on the frontier sound like a noble adventure. Civilizing influence, though they'd called it, young minds hungry for learning in a land of opportunity. They hadn't mentioned the loneliness, the absolute crushing isolation of being the only human soul visible in any direction with not even a farmhouse or fence post to suggest that people existed in this territory at all. Eleanor touched the locket at her throat. Her mother's the only valuable thing she owned besides her books, and whispered a prayer she'd learned as a child. Her mother would have been horrified to see her here, but her mother had died 2 years ago, and her father had remarried within the year to a woman who made it abundantly clear that a grown stepdaughter was an inconvenience to be solved. Teaching out west had seemed like dignity, like purpose, like escape. Now it just seemed like suicide by geography. The first coyote appeared as the sun touched the mountains. Eleanor saw the shadow first, a low slink of movement against the sage about 50 yards out. Her breath caught. She'd never seen a coyote except in illustrations, but she recognized the slope of its shoulders, the way it moved with liquid patience. Then another appeared. And another. They were watching her. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting, and took a careful step closer to her trunk, as if 3 feet of difference would matter, as if the solid weight of her possessions, books and clothes, and one good winter coat could somehow protect her from wild animals that viewed her as dinner. "Go away," she said, then louder. "Go on, leave me alone." Her voice sounded so small out here. The coyotes didn't react at all. The wind picked up as darkness crept across the prairie like spilled ink. Eleanor's traveling dress, practical brown wool, high-collared and respectable, was all wrong for this. Too warm for the day's heat, too thin for the cold that now bit through to her skin. She'd packed a shawl in her carpet bag, but that meant opening the bag, turning her back on the coyotes, showing vulnerability. She stood frozen, trying to decide if modesty and caution would kill her faster than cold, when she heard the sound. Hoofbeats. A wagon. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Someone had come. The town had sent someone just as the driver had promised. She wasn't going to die out here after all, but the relief lasted only seconds before a new fear replaced it. Who was coming? She'd heard the stories, of course. Every woman traveling west heard them whispered in train cars and coach stations. Stories of women gone missing, of homesteads attacked, of men who lived outside the law in these empty territories. The West was full of opportunity, yes, but also full of desperate people and dark corners where civilized rules didn't reach. The wagon materialized from the dimness like something conjured, a sturdy farm wagon pulled by two horses driven by a figure she couldn't make out in the failing light. Eleanor straightened her spine and tried to look composed, professional, like a teacher meeting the school board rather than a terrified girl who'd been imagining her own death for hours. The wagon slowed as it approached, then stopped about 20 feet away. For a long moment, nothing happened. The driver sat motionless, studying her. Eleanor couldn't see his face beneath his hat, but she felt the weight of his assessment. The coyotes had vanished back into the sage. Then he climbed down, moving with an easy economy of motion that suggested strength without hurry. He was taller than her father, broader through the shoulders. He wore typical frontier clothes. Work pants, a shirt that might once have been blue, a leather vest, dark with age and weather, a gun belt at his hip that made her heart skip. He approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, and finally she could see his face. He wasn't old, maybe 30, maybe less. It was hard to tell with men out here where sun and wind aged them differently than city life. His face was lean and wind-burned with strong bones and eyes that held something careful in them. Not cruel, she thought, but cautious. Measuring. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough-edged with an accent she couldn't place. Southern maybe, but softened. "You waiting for someone?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "The school board from Promise Creek. They were supposed to send someone hours ago." He glanced at the darkening sky, then at her trunk, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, but understanding. "You the new teacher, then?" It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Eleanor Hayes, from Philadelphia. I was told—" "I know what you were told." He pushed his hat back slightly, and she saw more of his face, a strong jaw dark with stubble, and eyes that were gray or maybe blue in the dimness. "Problem is, there's only 3 families left in Promise Creek proper, and they're all dealing with a sick child tonight. Fever going around. No one's thinking about stagecoach schedules." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure crack. "But they knew I was coming. I sent a telegram. They confirmed. I'm sure they did." His tone wasn't unkind. "But out here surviving takes priority over planning. That's just how it is." She wanted to argue, to explain that this was unacceptable, that she'd come hundreds of miles based on their promises. But the exhaustion of the day, the fear, the heat, the terrible lonely hours suddenly crashed over her like a wave. Her throat closed up, her eyes burned. She would not cry in front of this stranger. "Well," she managed her voice tight, "thank you for stopping. If you could direct me to the nearest town, or perhaps to someone who might have a wagon available for hire." "Ma'am." He stepped closer, and she instinctively stepped back. He froze immediately, then raised both hands slightly, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you need to understand something. There's no town close enough to reach before full dark, no houses between here and Promise Creek. And this cold—" He looked at her thin dress. "You wouldn't make it through the night out here." "I have a coat," she said stubbornly. "That won't be enough." He said it flatly, stating fact without judgment. "It's April. Sun's warm, but these nights still drop below freezing. You'd be dead by morning." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hands trembled, so she gripped them together tighter. "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "That I simply trust a strange man and climb into his wagon? That I—" "No." He cut her off quietly. "I suggest you make a choice. You can trust me and let me take you to town where there's a boarding house run by Mrs. Peterson who will feed you and give you a warm bed. Or you can stay here and take your chances with the cold and the coyotes. Those are the options." Eleanor stared at him. In the near darkness, she could barely see his expression, but she could hear something in his voice that gave her pause. Not impatience, not threat, just a kind of tired honesty that reminded her oddly of her father before the new wife changed him. How do I know you're telling the truth? She asked, softer now. How do I know you're not? She couldn't finish the sentence. It seemed too terrible to speak aloud. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You don't know. Can't know out here with just my word. But I'll tell you this. My name's Caleb Ward. I own the Circle W Ranch about 5 miles south of Promise Creek. I was in Copper Ridge selling cattle, and I'm heading home. I'll take you to Mrs. Peterson's, I'll carry your trunk inside, and then I'll leave. You'll never have to see me again if you don't want to. Why should I believe you? Because if I meant you harm, ma'am, I wouldn't bother talking. His voice went even quieter. And because you're making the same calculation every woman who comes west has to make, do you trust that most people are decent, or do you let fear make every decision? That's not an easy question, but it's one you'd better answer quick because it's getting colder. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. He was right about the cold. She could feel it seeping through her dress, making her muscles clench. The thin cotton of her undergarments felt like paper against her skin. She thought about her father, who'd always told her to trust her instincts. She thought about the careful, controlled life she'd left behind in Philadelphia, where every choice was made for her, where safety meant suffocation. She thought about the teaching position she'd fought for, the chance to build something of her own in a place that needed what she could offer. And she thought about the simple fact that this man, this Caleb Ward, was right. She had no real choice at all. All right, she said finally. I'll accept your help. But I want to know if you saw someone from town, would they vouch for you? Yes, ma'am. Anyone in Promise Creek knows me. Been there 3 years now. He turned and walked back to his wagon, giving her space. I'll get your trunk. He lifted it like it weighed nothing, muscles shifting beneath his shirt as he settled it in the wagon bed. Eleanor picked up her carpet bag and approached her legs unsteady beneath her. Caleb reached down to help her up, and after a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. His grip was rough with calluses, but surprisingly careful, steadying her as she climbed onto the wagon seat. Then he released her immediately and walked around to his side, putting the width of the wagon between them. There's a blanket behind the seat, he said as he climbed up. You'll want it. Eleanor found the wool blanket worn but clean and pulled it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and desperately welcome. Caleb clicked to the horses and the wagon lurched into motion. They rode in silence for several minutes. The darkness was complete now, broken only by a rising moon that painted everything silver and strange. Eleanor's fear had dulled to exhaustion, but her awareness of the man beside her remained sharp. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the way he held the reins loosely confident but not careless, the way he watched the road ahead with focused attention, the gun at his hip that she tried not to look at. You're a long way from Philadelphia, he said eventually, his voice barely carrying over the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Yes, she didn't elaborate. What makes a young woman leave a city like that for a place like Promise Creek? It was a fair question, one she'd been asked before. Usually she gave a polished answer about the dignity of teaching, about bringing education to the frontier. But something about the darkness, the intimacy of shared space in this vast emptiness, made her answer differently. I needed to leave, she said simply. He glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. Family trouble. You could say that. Running from something or toward something. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter. Both, I suppose. Does it matter? No, ma'am. Your business is your own. He was quiet again, then added, But you should know out here people don't much care where you came from. They care who you are now in the present. It's one of the better things about the territory. And the worst things, everything else. But she heard the faint trace of humor in his voice. It's hard country. Beautiful, but hard. You'll learn that quick enough. The wagon crested a small rise, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Promise Creek in the distance, a handful of lights scattered like dropped stars in the darkness. It was smaller than she'd imagined, much smaller. That's the whole town. She couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. That's it. General store boarding house church that doubles as a school saloon livery stable. Maybe 20 families in the area if you count the outlying ranches. He must have heard her disappointment because he added, It's not Philadelphia, but it's got good people. Mostly. Mostly. Every place has a few bad apples. Promise Creek's no different. He guided the horses down the slope toward the lights. But Mrs. Peterson's the genuine article. She'll look after you proper. They reached the edge of town, if a cluster of buildings could be called an edge, and Caleb drove the wagon straight to a 2-story frame house with light glowing warm in its windows. A hand-painted sign read, Peterson's Boarding House, Clean Rooms, Hot Meals. Before Caleb could climb down, the front door opened, and a solid gray-haired woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Caleb Ward, that better not be livestock you're delivering at this hour. She called out, her voice carrying clear authority. No, ma'am. Got your new school teacher. Found her stranded at the Copper Ridge crossing. Stranded? Mrs. Peterson came down the steps, her expression shifting to concern. Good Lord, the fever had us so turned around I completely forgot. She reached the wagon and looked up at Eleanor with genuine distress. My dear girl, I am so sorry. We got your telegram. We fully intended to meet your stage, but little Emma Cartwright took sick this morning, and the whole town's been in a state. Are you all right? The kindness in her voice, the maternal worry, nearly undid Eleanor's composure completely. She managed a nod. I'm fine. Mr. Ward was kind enough to help me. Well, thank goodness for that. Mrs. Peterson turned to Caleb as he climbed down. You're a good man, Caleb. I won't forget this. No need for thanks, just doing the decent thing. He moved to the back of the wagon and lifted Eleanor's trunk again. Where do you want this? Room at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. I'll show you. Mrs. Peterson helped Eleanor down from the wagon with steady, capable hands. Come inside, dear. You look half frozen. I've got stew on the stove and coffee that'll put fire back in your bones. Eleanor followed her into the house, grateful for the warmth that enveloped her immediately. The boarding house was simple but spotlessly clean, with oil lamps casting golden light on whitewashed walls and polished wood floors. Somewhere a clock ticked steadily. It smelled like bread and coffee and wood smoke, homely smells that made her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. Caleb carried her trunk upstairs with Mrs. Peterson directing, while Eleanor stood in the front hall, still wrapped in his blanket, trying to absorb that she'd made it. She was here. She was safe. When Caleb came back down, he paused at the front door, hat in his hands. Miss Hayes, he said formally, I hope Promise Creek treats you well. Thank you, she managed. For everything. I'm sorry, I mean, I appreciate... No need. He settled his hat back on his head. You made a hard choice. Can't fault you for being careful. He nodded to Mrs. Peterson. Ma'am, I'll see you Sunday. Then he was gone back out into the night, and Eleanor heard the wagon pull away. Come on now, Mrs. Peterson said gently, guiding her toward the kitchen. Let's get some food in you and then you can sleep. Everything looks better after sleep. Eleanor let herself be led, let herself be fed, let herself be mothered by this stranger who asked no questions and offered only comfort. Later, lying in a clean bed under heavy quilts, she listened to the wind outside and thought about the man who'd saved her, Caleb Ward, with his careful hands and quiet voice. She'd been terrified of him at first, but as she drifted towards sleep, she realized the fear had changed to something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the beginning of trust. The frontier was teaching her its first lesson. Survival required letting go of the life she'd known and learning to read this new world on its own terms. She'd have to become someone different out here, someone braver. Eleanor touched her mother's locket and whispered a prayer of gratitude into the darkness. Then she slept dreamless and deep, while Promise Creek settled into the quiet hours before dawn. Morning came with birdsong. Eleanor didn't recognize, and light streaming through thin curtains. She woke disoriented, reaching for familiar things that weren't there before memory returned in a rush. Wyoming, Promise Creek, the long terrifying day and the stranger who'd rescued her. She dressed quickly in her second traveling dress, navy blue, equally practical, and pinned her hair into a proper bun before venturing downstairs. Voices drifted from the kitchen, women's voices, and the smell of fresh coffee made her stomach clench with hunger. Mrs. Peterson looked up from the stove as Eleanor appeared in the doorway. There she is. Come in, dear. Come in. We've got eggs and bacon and biscuits coming. Coffee's ready now if you need it. Two other women sat at the kitchen table, one younger blonde and pretty in a sun-faded calico dress, the other older with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. They both studied Eleanor with open interest. "This is Sarah Cartwright, Mrs. Peterson said, indicating the younger woman, "and Mary Chen. Ladies, meet Eleanor Hayes, our new teacher." "How do you do?" Eleanor said, trying for Philadelphia polish, despite feeling rumpled and uncertain. "We do fine," Sarah said, her accent pure Wyoming. "Better question is, how do you do after getting abandoned yesterday, Lord, when we realized no one had met your stage?" "Emma's fever broke around midnight," Mary Chen interjected, in an accent that carried traces of something else. Chinese Eleanor guessed, surprised to find such diversity even here. "So Sarah finally got some sleep, and then we remembered. I felt terrible," Sarah finished. "Just terrible. If Caleb hadn't found you." "But he did," Eleanor said quickly, not wanting to dwell on alternative outcomes. "And Mrs. Peterson has been wonderfully kind. I'm perfectly fine." "Caleb Ward is one of the good ones," Mrs. Peterson said, setting a plate before Eleanor. "Known him since he came to Promise Creek. Keeps to himself mostly. Works hard. Treats people square. When his neighbor's barn burned 2 years back, he spent a month helping rebuild without asking for anything in return." "He married?" Sarah asked too casually. "Sarah Cartwright, you're married yourself," Mrs. Peterson said, but there was amusement in her voice. "I'm asking for Eleanor, not for me." Sarah grinned. She should know the lay of the land. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I'm here to teach, not to, I'm not looking for—" "No one's looking until they are," Mary said wisely. "But to answer the question, no, Caleb's not married. Not courting anyone either, far as anyone knows. Comes to town for church on Sundays, plays chess with Doc Morrison. Sometimes that's about it." "He's a good man," Mrs. Peterson repeated, as if this needed emphasis. "Lost his whole family back in Missouri during the war. Came west to start over like a lot of folks. Built his ranch from nothing." Eleanor absorbed this information while eating breakfast that tasted better than anything she'd had in weeks. War, loss, starting over. She understood those motivations more than these women knew. "Now," Mrs. Peterson continued, clearly ready to change the subject, "let's talk about practical matters. The schoolhouse is just past the church. You can't miss it. It's not fancy, but it's sound. There are 12 children of school age right now, ranging from 6 to 14. Most can read a little, some better than others. You'll have to assess them yourself." "Supplies?" Eleanor asked. "Basic primers, some slates, chalk. We take up a collection to buy what we can, but money's tight. You'll have to be creative." Sarah leaned forward. "But the families appreciate what you're doing. Teaching is precious out here. Most of us only had a few years ourselves." They spent the next hour going over details: which families had children, what to expect, how the previous teacher, an elderly man who'd returned east for health reasons, had managed things. Eleanor took mental notes, feeling her purpose solidify with each piece of information. This was real. This was happening. She was going to teach these children, make a difference in this remote corner of the world. After breakfast, Mrs. Peterson walked her over to see the schoolhouse. It was modest one-room wood frame with a potbelly stove in the corner and windows that needed washing. But it had benches for the children, a desk for her, a blackboard someone had painted carefully on one wall. It smelled like chalk dust and old wood, and when Eleanor stood at the front of the room, she could imagine it full of young faces, eager and curious. "It's perfect," she said softly. "It's humble," Mrs. Peterson corrected. "But it's yours now. Classes start Monday, so you've got the rest of the week to prepare. I'll spread the word that you're here and ready." Eleanor spent that day cleaning the schoolhouse, taking inventory, organizing. Physical work felt good after the long journey, after the paralysis of fear that had gripped her yesterday. She swept and scrubbed and arranged books, and with each task she felt more rooted, more real. By late afternoon she was exhausted but satisfied. She locked the schoolhouse door and turned to find a small boy watching her from a respectful distance, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and enormous eyes. "Are you the new teacher?" he asked shyly. "I am. Eleanor Hayes." She smiled. "What's your name?" "Thomas. Thomas Peterson. I live at the boarding house with Grandma." Then we're neighbors. Eleanor walked closer. Do you like school, Thomas? He shrugged a gesture so perfectly childlike it made her smile widen. It's all right, I guess. Are you going to be strict? I'm going to be fair, she said, and I'm going to expect you to work hard and be kind. Think you can manage that. Thomas considered this seriously. Probably. Are you scared? The question surprised her. Scared of what? Of being here. My grandma says you're from a big city, that everything here must seem scary and different. Eleanor knelt down so they were eye level. You know what, Thomas, I was very scared yesterday. But today, I'm less scared. And I think tomorrow I'll be even less scared than that. That's how courage works. You practice it a little bit at a time. He thought about this, then nodded. Mr. Ward says something like that. He says being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the thing anyway. Mr. Ward sounds wise. He's teaching me to ride. Well, he taught me last summer. Maybe he'll teach you too. Maybe, Eleanor said, though the thought of getting on a horse filled her with immediate anxiety. We'll see. Thomas ran off toward home, and Eleanor walked slowly back to the boarding house, thinking about bravery and teaching and the strange way life had delivered her here to this small town at the edge of everything. That night, lying in bed, she wrote a letter to her father, carefully neutral, describing the town and the school, without mentioning the terror of being abandoned or the stranger who'd saved her. She wanted him to know she was safe, that she'd made the right choice. But as she sealed the envelope, she wondered if she was trying to convince him or herself. Sunday arrived with clear skies and the prospect of church. Mrs. Peterson informed Eleanor that attendance was expected, not mandatory perhaps, but definitely expected if one wanted to be accepted by the community. It's where everyone gathers, she explained. Where news gets shared and business gets discussed. You'll meet most of the families today. Eleanor wore her best dress, dark green wool with black trim, respectable and modest, and walked to church with Mrs. Peterson and Thomas. The church was small and white, with a bell tower that looked optimistic compared to the size of the congregation that gathered. But gathered they did families arriving on foot, and by wagon, everyone dressed in their Sunday clothes, everyone curious about the new teacher. Eleanor shook hands and tried to remember names. Sarah Cartwright introduced her husband James, and their daughter Emma recovered from her fever. Mary Chen's husband ran the general store. There was a rancher named Sullivan with 3 boys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A widow named Mrs. Grant with 2 quiet daughters. Faces and names swirled together, overwhelming and earnest. Then Caleb Ward arrived just before the service started. Eleanor recognized him immediately, even though he looked different in cleaned-up clothes, dark trousers, and a white shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He slipped into a pew near the back, nodding politely to various people, his expression neutral. Their eyes met across the church just for a second. He gave her a small nod, acknowledgement nothing more, then looked away. But Eleanor found herself intensely aware of him throughout the service of his presence. A few rows back of the way, people treated him with easy respect. After church, the congregation gathered outside to talk. Eleanor was immediately surrounded by mothers discussing their children, asking about her plans for the school. She answered as best she could, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Miss Hayes, the voice came from behind her, low and familiar. She turned to find Caleb Ward standing a polite distance away, hat still in his hands. Mr. Ward, good morning. Morning. He looked like he was searching for words, which gave her an odd sense of relief. So she wasn't the only one who found this awkward. I wanted to check that you got settled all right. No trouble after I left you. None at all. Mrs. Peterson has been wonderful. Eleanor hesitated, then added, I wanted to thank you again, properly, for helping me the other night. I realize I wasn't very gracious at the time. You were scared. That's reasonable. His gray eyes held hers steadily. How's the schoolhouse? It needs work, but it's sound. I'm looking forward to starting on Monday. The stove, reliable. The question surprised her. I'm not sure. I haven't tried to use it yet. You should test it before the children arrive. These spring mornings can still be cold, and you don't want to discover a problem when you've got a room full of students. He glanced toward the small building visible from where they stood. I could take a look at it this afternoon if you like. Make sure it's drawing properly. It was a practical offer sensibly made, but Eleanor felt oddly flustered by it. That's very kind, but I don't want to impose on your Sunday. It's no imposition. I'm heading that direction anyway. He settled his hat back on his head. I'll stop by around 2 if that suits you. Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Peterson appeared at her elbow. Caleb Ward, are you monopolizing our new teacher? No, ma'am. Just offering to check the schoolhouse stove. That's thoughtful of you. Mrs. Peterson's eyes held knowing amusement. Eleanor, dear, the Cartwrights have invited us to lunch. We should get going. Eleanor let herself be swept away, but she glanced back once to see Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he turned and walked toward his wagon alone. At 2 o'clock, Eleanor was at the schoolhouse when Caleb arrived. He knocked on the door frame, even though it stood open waiting for her invitation before entering. Come in, she called, setting down the primer she'd been reviewing. He stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around his presence. He moved to the stove immediately, all business checking the flue and the damper, opening the door to peer inside. You've got a bird's nest in here, he said after a moment. Common problem. They build in warm places during winter, then forget to leave. He carefully removed a tangle of twigs and grass. I'll check the chimney from outside. Eleanor watched him work, struck by his competence, the way his hands moved with certainty. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply doing a job that needed doing. When he came back inside, his shirt was smudged with soot, but his expression was satisfied. Should work fine now. Want me to light it so you can see? Yes, please. He built a fire efficiently, paper kindling larger pieces of wood in careful arrangement. Within minutes, flames were crackling and warmth began to spread through the room. Give it about 10 minutes, then check that the heat's distributing evenly, he instructed. If one side stays cold, there might be a blockage I missed. Thank you. I would never have thought to check. You'll learn. He closed the stove door and straightened. Wyoming teaches everyone eventually. They stood awkwardly for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Eleanor searched for something to say, but everything that came to mind seemed either too formal or too familiar. Thomas Peterson mentioned you taught him to ride, she finally managed. Last summer, yes. He was scared of horses, but his grandmother thought he should learn, so I gave him lessons. Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers. Out here riding isn't optional. It's survival. I've never been on a horse, Eleanor admitted. Never. We had carriages in Philadelphia, hired coaches. I've simply never had occasion to learn. He studied her thoughtfully. You'll want to change that. Winter comes early here, and sometimes it comes hard. If you get caught somewhere, being able to ride could make the difference between getting home safe or freezing in a ditch. The blunt assessment should have frightened her, but instead it sparked something like defiance in her chest. Then I suppose I should learn. I suppose you should. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it by the door. I could teach you if you're willing. Thomas's old mare is gentle, and Sunday afternoons are usually free. Eleanor's heart beat faster. It was a practical offer, nothing more. But accepting meant spending time with this man, meant trusting him, meant stepping further into this new life she was building. Next Sunday, she heard herself say. Next Sunday. He nodded once, then headed for the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back. You're going to do fine here, Miss Hayes. The children are lucky to have you. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with the warm stove and the sudden, startling realization that she wanted to see him again. Wanted to learn what made a man leave everything behind and start over in harsh country. Wanted to understand the quiet strength she sensed beneath his careful reserve. She touched her mother's locket and smiled despite herself. Maybe the frontier had more to teach her than she'd imagined. Monday morning arrived with the weight of expectation pressing against Eleanor's ribs like a corset laced too tight. She'd been awake since before dawn, rehearsing introductions in her mind, arranging and rearranging lesson plans that suddenly seemed inadequate for children she'd never met. The navy dress felt too formal, the green too casual, until finally she settled on a simple gray cotton that seemed appropriately teacherly without being severe. Mrs. Peterson pressed a tin lunch pail into her hands at breakfast. You'll need your strength, she said with the knowing smile of someone who'd raised children and understood what lay ahead. And don't let the Sullivan boys rattle you. They're more bark than bite, but they will test you. They test everyone. Thomas walked with her to the schoolhouse, chattering about his favorite subjects, mostly recess and lunch, with a grudging admission that he didn't mind arithmetic when it involved real things like counting cattle or measuring fence posts. Eleanor listened, grateful for the distraction, though her stomach remained knotted with nerves. The children began arriving just after 8. They came in small clusters, siblings holding hands, older ones herding younger ones. All of them eyeing Eleanor with the frank curiosity of those unaccustomed to strangers. She stood at the door, greeting each one, learning names, making mental notes about who seemed shy and who seemed bold. The Sullivan boys arrived last, riding in on a single horse that they left tied carelessly to the hitching post. The oldest, maybe 14, all gangly limbs and defensive swagger, gave her a look that was pure challenge. His brothers flanked him like deputies, younger versions of the same lean, sun-darkened defiance. "You're late," Eleanor said calmly. "Had chores," the oldest replied. "Ranch doesn't stop for school." "Then perhaps you should wake earlier." She held his gaze steadily. "Your name, Jack Sullivan." He said it like she should already know, like the name itself carried weight. "Well, Jack Sullivan, take your seat. We're about to begin." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe that she hadn't risen to his bait. He slouched past her into the schoolhouse, his brothers following. Eleanor took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked to the front of the room. 12 faces watched her. 12 pairs of eyes weighing, judging, deciding whether she was worth their time and respect. Eleanor thought of her own teachers in Philadelphia, the ones who'd commanded attention through fear or love or sheer force of personality. She thought of her mother, who'd always said that respect was earned through consistency, not demands. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the small space. "My name is Miss Hayes, and I'm honored to be your teacher. I've come a long way to be here, and I intend to make every day count. I expect you to work hard to be kind to each other and to remember that learning is a privilege that not every child gets. In return, I promise to be fair, to listen when you speak, and to help you become the best versions of yourselves. Do we have an agreement?" Silence held for a moment. Then a small girl in the front row, Emma Cartwright, recovered from her fever and solemn as a judge, raised her hand. "Yes, Emma. Will we learn about places, faraway places like where you're from?" Eleanor smiled. "Yes, geography, history, literature that takes us beyond Wyoming. The world is vast and you deserve to know about it." "Will we have to memorize boring things?" This from one of the Sullivan boys, the middle one. "You'll have to memorize useful things," Eleanor corrected. "Poetry that teaches you about language, historical dates that help you understand how we got here, mathematical formulas that help you build and measure and calculate. If I'm doing my job right, you won't find them boring." Jack Sullivan snorted softly, but Eleanor let it pass. First days were for establishing expectations, not battles. The morning proceeded in careful increments. She assessed reading levels by having each child read aloud from primers, making notes about who struggled with basic words and who read with fluid comprehension. She tested arithmetic by writing problems on the board, watching who solved them quickly and who stared in confusion. She asked questions about history and geography and science, mapping the gaps in their education. By noon, she had a clear picture-wide variation in skill levels gaps that reflected sporadic attendance and previous teachers who had done what they could with limited resources. But she also saw intelligence and curiosity, even in the ones who tried to hide it behind indifference. During lunch, the children scattered outside, and Eleanor sat at her desk eating Mrs. Peterson's packed meal, watching through the window as they played. The girls clustered together near the church steps, braiding grass into chains. The boys roughhoused, wrestling and racing, burning off energy they'd been forced to contain all morning. Thomas appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Miss Hayes, Emma wants to know if we can have a spelling bee on Fridays. The old teacher used to do that, and we liked it." "That sounds like an excellent tradition. Tell Emma, yes, we'll start this Friday." His face brightened and he ran back to deliver the news. Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest. They were beginning to trust her, to see her as their teacher, not just a strange woman from the East. The afternoon brought writing lessons and a geography discussion about the Wyoming Territory that turned into an animated debate about whether mountains or rivers were more important to settlement. Eleanor let the conversation flow, guiding rather than controlling, pleased to see even the Sullivan boys engaged despite themselves. When she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, several children lingered to ask questions or simply to study her up close, as if trying to commit her to memory. Emma touched the lace on Eleanor's cuff and asked if all ladies in Philadelphia wore such pretty things. Thomas wanted to know if she'd ever seen the ocean. Even Jack Sullivan paused at the door, something almost like approval in his expression before he turned away. Eleanor tidied the schoolhouse in the settling quiet exhaustion pulling at her bones, but satisfaction warming her through. She'd done it. Survived the first day. More than survived, she'd connected with them, begun building the foundation of trust and respect that real teaching required. She was locking the door when she heard a horse approaching. Caleb Ward rode up on a sturdy bay gelding, sitting the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and nodded to her. First day survived. Barely, but she was smiling. How did you know I'd still be here? Figured you for the type who'd stay late. Make sure everything's perfect. He glanced at the schoolhouse. How'd it go? Better than I feared. The children are bright, curious, though your friend Jack Sullivan seems determined to be difficult. Caleb's expression shifted, not quite amusement, but close. Jack's got reason to be prickly. His pa died 2 winters back, left him feeling like he needs to be the man of the family at 14. Pride makes boys do stupid things. I'll keep that in mind. Eleanor adjusted her shawl against the afternoon breeze. I didn't expect to see you today. Came to town for supplies, thought I'd check if the stove held up. It was perfect. Thank you again for fixing it. They stood in awkward silence, the kind that wanted to be filled but neither knew quite how. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. About Sunday, the writing lesson. Offer still stands if you're still willing. Eleanor's heart kicked against her ribs. All day she'd been so focused on teaching that she'd almost forgotten the promise hanging between them. Almost, but not quite. I'm willing, though I should warn you I'm likely to be terrible at it. Everyone's terrible at first. That's how learning works. He gathered his horse's reins. I'll come by the boarding house around 1. Wear trousers if you have them, or your oldest skirt and boots. I don't have trousers. Then we'll make do with a skirt. Just nothing fancy that you'd mourn getting dusty. He swung back into the saddle with that same effortless grace. See you Sunday, Miss Hayes. He rode off before she could respond, leaving Eleanor standing in the schoolhouse yard with the wind pulling at her skirts, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't quite name. Anticipation, perhaps, or the thrilling terror of stepping into yet another unknown. The week unfolded in a rhythm that felt almost like routine. Eleanor taught lessons, learned her students' quirks and capabilities, began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who belonged at the front of that small room. The children responded with growing trust, even Jack Sullivan, who still bristled but no longer openly challenged her authority. Sarah Cartwright visited one afternoon with a basket of apples for the students staying to watch Eleanor teach a history lesson about westward expansion. Afterward, she lingered, helping Eleanor tidy while they talked. You're good with them, Sarah said, stacking slates. Patient but firm. Emma comes home every day talking about what Miss Hayes said, what Miss Hayes taught them. You're making an impression. I'm trying. Eleanor wiped chalk dust from her hands. Though I wonder sometimes if I'm adequate to the task. There's so much they need to learn, and I have so few resources. You're doing more than adequate. The last teacher, Mr. Brennan, he was a good man, but old and tired. Mostly just had them copying texts. You're making them think, ask questions. That's different. Sarah paused, then added with studied casualness, I hear Caleb Ward's teaching you to ride. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. News travels quickly. In a town this size, Mary Chen saw him talking to you after church. Mrs. Peterson mentioned he'd be coming by on Sunday, and by Monday morning everyone knew. Sarah's smile was kind, not mocking. Don't worry, it's not gossip so much as interest. People like Caleb, they're glad to see him coming out of his shell a bit. His shell. He keeps to himself, always polite, always helpful when asked, but he doesn't let people close. Since you're new, maybe you don't see it, but the rest of us notice. He comes to church, does his trading, goes back to his ranch, doesn't socialize much beyond what's necessary. Sarah folded a cloth thoughtfully. So when he offers to teach someone to ride, spend time with them beyond basic neighborly duty, well, people notice. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure what it meant or if it meant anything beyond practical concern for her survival in this harsh place. "It's just a riding lesson," she said finally. "Maybe." Sarah's eyes held knowing warmth. "Or maybe it's how things start out here. We don't have fancy courtship rituals like you might be used to, just people helping each other, spending time together, seeing if something fits. I'm not looking for courtship. I'm here to teach." "I know, and that's exactly why it might happen anyway." Sarah touched her arm gently. "I'm not pushing Eleanor, just saying don't be so focused on what you came here for that you miss what might be waiting for you." The conversation stayed with Eleanor as the week progressed, coloring her thoughts in ways she tried to ignore. She wasn't here for romance. She'd come to escape an unhappy situation, to build something of her own, to prove she could stand on her own feet without father or husband to define her. But she'd be lying if she said she didn't think about Caleb Ward, about his quiet strength and careful hands, about the way he'd saved her that first night without asking for gratitude or recognition, about the steadiness in his eyes that suggested depth she'd barely glimpsed. Sunday arrived bright and warm, spring asserting itself with wildflowers dotting the prairie and birdsong filling the morning air. Eleanor attended church dressed in her usual careful propriety, but underneath she wore her oldest chemise and her most practical corset. And back at the boarding house, she had a worn brown skirt and sturdy boots waiting for her after lunch. Caleb arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, riding his bay gelding and leading a smaller horse, a dappled gray mare with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. "This is Rosie," he said, as Eleanor approached, nervous energy making her movement stiff. She raised 3 foals and carried a child to school for 2 years before his family moved east. She's as steady as they come. Rosie turned her head to regard Eleanor with what seemed like gentle amusement, as if she knew exactly how terrified Eleanor was and found it endearing rather than concerning. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said, because it seemed polite, though her honest opinion was that Rosie was terrifyingly large. "She's practical," Caleb corrected. "Beauty matters less than temperament with horses." "Come on, I'll show you how to approach her." He guided Eleanor through the basics with patient thoroughness. How to let the horse smell her hand, how to stroke her neck, how to speak in low, calm tones that conveyed confidence even when you felt none. His voice stayed steady and unrushed, never mocking her fear, simply working around it. "Now," he said, "we'll start with just getting familiar with the saddle. No mounting yet, just understanding the parts and how they work." Eleanor learned about stirrups and reins, about how to check the girth, to make sure the saddle was secure, about the mechanics of balance and control. Caleb's explanations were clear and practical, stripped of jargon, focused on what she needed to know rather than overwhelming her with detail. After 30 minutes of groundwork, he finally said, "Ready to try sitting in the saddle?" Eleanor's heart hammered. "What if I fall?" "Then you fall. Ground's not that far, and I'll be right here." "Oh." He positioned himself beside Rosie, hands ready to help. "Left foot in the stirrup, grip the saddle horn, swing your right leg over. I'll steady you." It took 3 attempts, twice her skirt tangled, and once she lost her nerve halfway through the motion. But on the 4th try, she found herself sitting astride Rosie's broad back, higher off the ground than she'd expected, gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity. "Breathe," Caleb said calmly. "You're doing fine. Rosie's not going anywhere. Just sit for a minute and get used to the feeling." Eleanor focused on breathing on the solid warmth of the horse beneath her, on Caleb's steady presence beside them. Gradually, incrementally, her panic eased into something almost like wonder. "I'm on a horse," she said, half laughing. "You are." Caleb's smile was slight but genuine. "Now, let's see about staying there when she moves." He kept hold of Rosie's bridle and led her in slow circles around the yard behind the boarding house, patient and unhurried. Eleanor bounced awkwardly at first, unable to find the rhythm, certain she'd slide off at any moment. But Caleb talked her through it, how to move with the horse rather than against her, how to keep her weight centered, how to trust that Rosie knew what she was doing even if Eleanor didn't. By the end of the hour, Eleanor was walking Rosie in circles without Caleb's guidance reins held correctly, posture improving. She felt absurdly proud of this small accomplishment, this first step toward frontier competence. When Caleb finally helped her dismount, her legs trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. He steadied her automatically when she stumbled, his hands firm on her arms until she found her balance. "You did well," he said, releasing her as soon as she was steady. "Better than most first-timers. You didn't panic and you listened. That's half the battle. I was terrified the entire time." "I know, but you did it anyway." He gathered Rosie's reins. "That's courage." "Same lesson I told Thomas." Eleanor brushed dust from her skirt, ridiculously pleased by his approval. "When's the next lesson?" "Next Sunday if you're willing. We'll work on mounting by yourself and maybe try a short trail ride if you're feeling confident." "I'll be ready." They stood for a moment in the afternoon sun, horses cropping grass nearby, the sounds of Promise Creek drifting on the breeze. Eleanor searched for words to thank him, to express what these lessons meant, beyond the practical skills being taught. "Caleb," she began, then hesitated. "Why are you doing this? I mean, I'm grateful, but you barely know me, and this takes time away from your ranch work." He was quiet, looking at the horizon rather than at her. When he spoke, his voice carried careful honesty. "When I came out here 3 years ago, I didn't know anything. How to build a house. Run cattle, survive winters that tried to kill you. People helped me. Tom Bradshaw taught me to read brands and spot good breeding stock. Doc Morrison spent 2 weeks teaching me basic veterinary care so I wouldn't lose animals to preventable problems. Mary Chen gave me credit at the store when my first winter nearly bankrupted me." He finally looked at her. "You help people because that's how communities survive. And because," he paused, choosing words, "because you deserve to survive out here. You came a long way to teach these children. Least I can do is help you stay alive while you do it." The sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's throat tight. "Well, thank you for all of it." He nodded once, then swung into his saddle. "See you in church, Miss Hayes." She watched him ride away Rosie, following on a lead rope, until they disappeared down the main road. Then she walked back to the boarding house, muscles aching, heart strangely full. Mrs. Peterson was waiting on the porch, knitting in hand, expression carefully neutral. "How'd it go?" "I stayed on. Didn't fall even once." "That's good. Caleb's a patient teacher." Mrs. Peterson's needles clicked rhythmically. "He's a good man, Eleanor. I hope you know that." "Everyone keeps telling me so." "That's because it's true, and because—" She paused, studied Eleanor over her spectacles. "Because we like seeing him care about something besides work and survival. He's been alone too long, carrying too much grief. It's nice to see him smile again." Eleanor sank into the chair beside her, tired and confused and somehow happy. "I'm not trying to make him smile. I'm just learning to ride." "I know, dear, but sometimes the best things start with just learning something new." Mrs. Peterson's smile was gentle. "And sometimes a cowboy teaches a city girl to ride, and along the way they teach each other how to live again." The following weeks fell into a pattern that felt like the beginning of something Eleanor couldn't yet name. She taught Monday through Friday, pouring herself into lesson plans and student progress, watching her children grow more confident in their learning. Jack Sullivan slowly revealed himself to be sharp-minded beneath the defensive swagger, while Emma Cartwright blossomed into a natural leader who helped younger students with patient kindness. Thomas Peterson developed a love for history that surprised everyone, including himself. Saturday was for preparation and rest. Eleanor spent mornings in the schoolhouse organizing the coming week, afternoons helping Mrs. Peterson with household tasks, or visiting with Sarah and Mary, slowly building friendships that anchored her to this place. And Sundays became riding lessons. Each week, Caleb appeared with Rosie, patient and thorough, pushing Eleanor just beyond her comfort zone without overwhelming her. She learned to mount without help, to sit a trot, without bouncing like a sack of flour, to guide Rosie through turns and stops with increasing confidence. They graduated from circles in the yard to short rides along the creek trail where cottonwoods offered shade and Caleb pointed out landmarks she should remember. "That's Widow's Rock," he said one Sunday in late May, indicating a distinctive formation. "If you're ever lost, head for that, and you'll find the trail to town." "I hope I'm never in a position to need that information." "Hope's good. Knowledge is better." But his tone was mild, not chiding. They talked during those rides, conversation coming easier as the weeks passed. Eleanor learned about his Missouri childhood, the family farm lost to border violence during the war, the years of drifting before he found Wyoming and decided to stop running. He spoke of building his ranch with his own hands of neighbors who'd become something like family of simple satisfactions found in work well done. In return, she told him about Philadelphia, about her mother's death, and her father's remarriage, about feeling like a burden in her own home, about choosing teaching not just as escape, but as purpose, as proof she could be something beyond society's expectations for unmarried daughters. "You're brave," Caleb said one afternoon as they walked their horses back toward town. "Coming out here alone, building a life from nothing, that takes more courage than most people have." "I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm constantly pretending I know what I'm doing." "That's pretty much everyone out here." His smile was slight but warm. "Difference is you're honest about it." In early June, he surprised her by bringing a different horse, his own gelding, taller and more spirited than Rosie. "Time to try something with more spirit," he said. "Rosie's wonderful for learning, but you need to experience what a real working horse feels like." Eleanor eyed the bay nervously. "He looks like he has opinions." "Copper has plenty of opinions, but he's well-trained and responsive. I'll be right beside you the whole time." Caleb held Copper steady while Eleanor mounted his hands ready to catch her if needed. "There. See? Not so different, but it was different." Copper moved with more energy, more power, requiring Eleanor to pay constant attention to balance and control. They rode together toward the edge of town, past the last houses into open prairie, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant yellows and purples. "You're doing fine," Caleb said, watching her with approval. "Natural seat good hands. Another few weeks and you'll be ready for a real ride." "This feels pretty real to me." "I mean a long ride. Out to my ranch, maybe. Let you see what's beyond town limits." Eleanor's heart quickened at the suggestion. Visiting his ranch felt significant somehow, crossing an invisible line from neighborly help to something more personal. But before she could respond, Copper spooked at a jackrabbit dancing sideways with a suddenness that sent Eleanor sliding. She would have fallen, should have fallen, but Caleb reacted instantly, spurring close and catching her arm, steadying her until she regained her seat. "Easy," he said, his voice calm though his grip was firm. "You're all right. Breathe." Eleanor's heart pounded, adrenaline flooding through her. Caleb held her arm a moment longer than necessary, his eyes searching her face with concern that felt almost tender. "I'm fine," she managed. "Just startled." "You stayed on. That's what matters." He released her slowly. "Ready to head back." They rode toward town in charged silence, something unspoken humming in the air between them. When they reached the boarding house and Caleb helped her dismount, his hands lingered at her waist, a heartbeat longer than needed. "Eleanor," her name not Miss Hayes, said quietly, almost questioningly. She looked up at him at the gray eyes that held such careful intensity and felt the world narrow to just the two of them standing in summer sunlight, with dust motes dancing and her heart beating hard enough she thought he must hear it. "Yes." He seemed to struggle for words. Jaw working, then, finally, just shook his head. "Nothing. I'll see you next week." But it wasn't nothing, Eleanor thought, as she watched him ride away. Something was shifting between them, growing from practical necessity into something tender and uncertain and terrifying. Something that made her think about futures she hadn't let herself imagine. That night lying in bed, she admitted the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for Caleb Ward, for his quiet strength and patient teaching, for the way he never made her feel foolish or weak, for the careful way he'd rebuilt his life from tragedy into something solid and good. She was falling for a cowboy in Wyoming, which was so far from any plan she'd ever made that she almost laughed. Except it didn't feel funny. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, like the prairie itself stretching endlessly toward a horizon she couldn't see, but somehow knew was there. Eleanor touched her mother's locket and whispered into the darkness, "What do I do?" But her mother was gone, and this choice, like everything else in her new life, was hers alone to make. The answer came sooner than Eleanor expected, delivered not through clarity of thought, but through the brutal indifference of Wyoming weather. It was a Friday in late September, and Eleanor had dismissed her students early after noticing dark clouds gathering on the western horizon with unnatural speed. She'd lived through enough prairie summers now to recognize danger when she saw it, even if she couldn't yet read all the signs the way locals could. "Go straight home," she'd told them, voice firm, despite the unease prickling her spine. "No dawdling. If the weather turns, find shelter immediately." The children had scattered quickly, sensing the urgency in her tone, and Eleanor had watched them go with growing anxiety. The wind was picking up, carrying a metallic smell she'd learned meant snow, even when the temperature didn't seem cold enough. The clouds roiled and churned bruised purple-black against a sky that had been clear blue just an hour before. She should have left immediately. Should have walked straight back to the boarding house while the trail was still visible, and the wind merely strong rather than violent. But she'd made the mistake of tidying the schoolhouse first, of banking the stove properly, and securing the windows, of being responsible when she should have been running. By the time she locked the schoolhouse door and turned toward town, the world had transformed into something hostile and strange. The wind hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and nearly knocking her sideways. Snow came with it, not gentle flakes but hard pellets that stung her face and hands. Within minutes, visibility dropped to mere feet, the familiar landscape dissolving into white chaos. Eleanor pulled her shawl over her head and started walking, trying to follow what she thought was the path toward town. The wind screamed around her, disorienting, making it impossible to tell if she was moving in the right direction. Her feet found uneven ground, where the trail should have been smooth, and panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She'd heard stories about blizzards, about people freezing to death 50 feet from their own doors because they couldn't see where they were going, about bodies found in spring, huddled against fence posts or collapsed in ditches, victims of weather that showed no mercy to the unprepared. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Don't stop. Don't sit down." But the cold was seeping through her dress, through her shawl, into her bones. Her hands had gone numb. Her face burned with the sting of snow and wind. She couldn't feel her feet anymore, couldn't tell if she was still on any kind of path or just wandering into empty prairie. How long had she been walking? 10 minutes, 30 time had lost meaning in the white roar of the storm. Eleanor stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Her breath came in gasping sobs that froze in her throat. This was how she would die, she thought with strange clarity. Not dramatically, not memorably, just foolishly, a city girl who'd stayed too long in a schoolhouse and paid for it with her life. She should have learned more, should have asked more questions, should have... The shape materialized from the snow so suddenly she nearly screamed. A dark mass, solid and large, moving toward her with purpose. Horse and rider emerging from the storm like something conjured from desperation and prayer. Caleb. She knew him instantly, despite the snow caking his hat and coat, despite visibility so poor she could barely see his face. She knew him by the way he sat his horse, by the breadth of his shoulders, by something deeper than sight that recognized him on an elemental level. He reached her in 3 strides, dismounting before Copper had fully stopped, his hands gripping her arms through the inadequate fabric of her dress. "Eleanor." His voice was rough, urgent. "Christ, Eleanor, what were you thinking? I was trying." Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. "Trying to get home." "You were walking away from town. Another 100 yards and you'd have been in open prairie." He was already stripping off his heavy coat, wrapping it around her despite her weak protests. "Can you ride?" "I think yes. I think so." "Good." He lifted her onto Copper's back with no ceremony, then swung up behind her, pulling her tight against his chest. His arm locked around her waist, solid and secure. "Hold on to me. Don't let go no matter what." Eleanor gripped his arm with numb fingers and felt him spur Copper forward into the storm. She couldn't see where they were going, couldn't imagine how Caleb could navigate when everything was white chaos. But he rode with grim certainty, his body a wall of warmth at her back, his voice low and steady in her ear. "Almost there. You're doing fine. Just hold on." Time stretched and compressed. Eleanor drifted in and out of awareness, lulled by cold and exhaustion and the steady rhythm of Copper's gait. Caleb's voice kept pulling her back, insistent and grounding. "Stay awake, Eleanor. Talk to me. Tell me about Philadelphia." "Cold there too," she mumbled. "Not like this. Tell me about your house. What did it look like?" She tried to remember, tried to form words, but her mind felt slow and thick. Caleb's arm tightened around her. Eleanor, stay with me. Don't you dare give up now. The boarding house appeared suddenly, lamplight glowing warm through the windows, a beacon in the storm. Caleb rode straight to the porch and dismounted, pulling Eleanor down with him. She couldn't stand on her own, her legs refusing to hold her weight, so he simply lifted her and carried her toward the door. Mrs. Peterson must have been watching, must have been waiting because the door flew open before Caleb could knock. Dear God, she breathed, her face pale with shock. Get her inside. Mary put more wood on the fire. Sarah fetch blankets. Move. Caleb carried Eleanor into the parlor and set her carefully in the chair closest to the fireplace. The warmth hit her like a blow, making her skin burn and prickle painfully. She started shaking, violent tremors she couldn't control. How long was she out there? Mrs. Peterson demanded, already working on the buttons of Eleanor's dress with efficient fingers. I don't know. Maybe 20 minutes in the worst of it. Caleb crouched beside the chair, his face drawn with worry. She was walking the wrong direction. If I'd come 5 minutes later. But you didn't. Mrs. Peterson's voice was firm. You found her. She's here and she's going to be fine. Help me get this wet dress off her. Between the three women and Caleb's occasional assistance, they stripped Eleanor down to her chemise and wrapped her in layers of dry blankets. Mary brought hot coffee, heavily sweetened, holding the cup to Eleanor's lips while she sipped in small increments. The shaking continued, her body trying to generate heat it had lost to the storm. I'm sorry, Eleanor managed through chattering teeth. I should have left earlier. I was stupid. You were inexperienced, Mrs. Peterson corrected. There's a difference. Though Lord knows you've learned your lesson now. Caleb stood near the fireplace, snow melting from his clothes in puddles on the floor, watching Eleanor with an expression that made her chest ache. He looked haunted, she thought, shaken in a way she hadn't seen before. How did you know? She asked him. How did you know to come? Saw the storm building from my ranch. Knew it was going to be bad, knew you'd be at the schoolhouse. His voice was rough. I rode straight for town, but when I got there, Mrs. Peterson said you hadn't made it back yet, so I went looking. You could have died, Eleanor whispered. You could have gotten lost in the storm trying to find me. But I didn't. He said it flatly, as if the alternative was inconceivable. I knew where to look, knew which way you'd likely go if you got turned around. Sarah appeared with more blankets and a concerned expression. The storm's getting worse. Caleb, you can't possibly ride back to your ranch in this. You'll have to stay the night. I can bed down in the stable, he started, but Mrs. Peterson cut him off. You'll do no such thing. We have a spare room and you'll use it. You just saved this girl's life. You're not sleeping in a drafty stable. Her tone brooked no argument. Sarah, show him to the room. Mary, help me get Eleanor upstairs to bed. She needs proper rest and warmth. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes across the room, something profound and unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded once and followed Sarah upstairs while Mary and Mrs. Peterson helped Eleanor to her feet. Her room had been transformed. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth waited in her bed. The fire blazed high and extra quilts had been piled on for warmth. Mrs. Peterson settled her under the covers with maternal efficiency, tucking the blankets tight. You sleep now, she said firmly, and tomorrow you can properly thank the man who saved your life. But Eleanor couldn't sleep, not immediately. She lay in the warm darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, thinking about Caleb riding into that white chaos to find her. He'd known where to look. He'd come without hesitation, risking his own life because hers mattered to him. The realization settled over her like the weight of the quilts, warm, heavy, undeniable. This wasn't just riding lessons or neighborly concern anymore. This was something deeper, something that made a man ride into a deadly storm because the thought of her dying was unbearable. And she felt the same desperate gratitude, the same relief that he'd made it back safely, the same overwhelming awareness that they'd both come terrifyingly close to tragedy. Eleanor touched her mother's locket and whispered into the darkness, I'm falling in love with him. Saying it aloud made it real, made it impossible to deny or dismiss. She was falling in love with Caleb Ward, The quiet rancher who'd lifted her into his wagon that first terrible night and somehow gradually lifted her into a life she'd never imagined wanting. The storm raged for 2 days. Eleanor woke the next morning stiff and sore, but a live sunlight streaming through windows that revealed a world buried in white. Snow had drifted against buildings in waves, transforming Promise Creek into something beautiful and alien. The wind had died, leaving behind crystalline silence and impossible brightness. She dressed carefully, still tender from the cold, and made her way downstairs to find the household gathered around the kitchen table. Caleb sat with a cup of coffee, his hair damp from washing, wearing a borrowed shirt that was slightly too small across his shoulders. He looked up when she entered, and the relief in his eyes was naked and intense. "Morning," he said quietly. "Good morning." Eleanor took the chair Mrs. Peterson indicated, accepting coffee and biscuits with trembling hands. "Thank you for yesterday, for saving my life." "You already thanked me." "It bears repeating." She met his gaze directly. "I would have died out there if you hadn't come. I know that. I owe you everything." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would—" "No," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Not everyone would have ridden into a blizzard. Not everyone would have known where to look or would have kept searching. You did. And I want you to know that I understand what that means." Silence held for a moment, charged with things neither of them could say in front of Mrs. Peterson and Sarah and Mary, who were all pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "Well," Mrs. Peterson said briskly, breaking the tension, "what's done is done, and we're all grateful for Caleb's bravery. Now the question is, what happens next? The snow's stopped, but there's 3 feet of it out there, and more weather coming tonight. No one's going anywhere today." "I should try to make it back to my ranch," Caleb said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Cattle to check on, fences to inspect after the storm." "Your hired man can handle it for 1 day," Mrs. Peterson replied. "Besides, the drifts will take time to settle. Better to wait until tomorrow when you can see what you're riding through." So Caleb stayed, and the day took on a strange, timeless quality. The women worked on mending and cooking while Caleb helped Thomas clear snow from the porch and check the outbuildings for damage. Eleanor found herself watching him through the window, memorizing the way he moved, the easy strength in his shoulders, the patient way he explained things to Thomas. In the afternoon, when the work was done and they'd all eaten lunch, Caleb surprised everyone by producing a well-worn book from his saddlebag. "Thought maybe Thomas would like to hear a story," he said, almost shy about it. "If that's all right." He read to Thomas in the parlor while the storm picked up outside, his voice steady and expressive, bringing the adventure tale to life. Eleanor sat nearby with her mending, but she wasn't really sewing. She was listening to Caleb read, watching the animation in his face, seeing yet another layer of the man he was. When Thomas finally fell asleep, curled up on the sofa like a puppy, Caleb closed the book carefully and looked at Eleanor. "Walk with me," he asked quietly. "Just to the porch. I need some air." They bundled into coats and stepped outside, where the temperature had dropped sharply and stars blazed overhead with impossible brilliance. Their breath plumed white in the air, snow crunched under their boots. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, looking up at the sky. "It's deadly." Caleb's voice was rough. "That's what people don't understand about Wyoming. It's beautiful right up until it kills you." Eleanor turned to look at him. In the moonlight reflecting off snow, his face looked carved from stone, all hard angles and shadows. "You're angry with me," she said softly. "I'm angry at myself." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I should have checked on you sooner, should have ridden to the schoolhouse the minute I saw that storm building, not trusted that you'd know to leave early. Caleb, you can't blame yourself for my ignorance. I can when I was supposed to be teaching you." Now he did look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I was teaching you to ride, but I should have been teaching you everything. How to read weather, how to survive if you get caught out, how to respect what this land can do to you. Instead, I was just—" He stopped, jaw working. "I was just enjoying spending time with you, and I forgot that you're still learning, still vulnerable. I'm not a child who needs constant supervision. No, you're a stubborn woman from Philadelphia who thinks she can handle anything because she's smart and determined." His voice was harsh but not unkind. "And you can handle a lot. You're one of the bravest people I've met. But brave doesn't mean invincible, Eleanor. Yesterday proved that. She wanted to argue to defend herself, but the truth was he was right. She'd been careless, overconfident, and it had nearly cost her life. "You're right," she admitted quietly. "I should have left earlier, should have been more cautious. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me, just—" He turned away, gripping the porch rail with both hands. "Just promise me you'll be more careful. Promise me you won't take risks like that again." "I promise." They stood in silence for a long moment, the cold seeping through their coats, the night vast and crystalline around them. Finally, Caleb spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw you out there, stumbling through the snow, heading in the wrong direction..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I've never been that scared in my life. Not during the war, not when I lost my family, not ever. The thought of losing you, of being too late. But you weren't too late." Eleanor moved closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, the tension in his jaw. "You found me. You saved me. This time." He finally looked at her again, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her heart stutter. "What about next time? What if I'm not there? What if—" "Caleb!" She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. "You can't protect me from everything. That's not how life works even out here. I know that." His voice was rough with frustration. "But it doesn't stop me from wanting to, from needing to make sure you're safe." The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. This was the moment she realized, the moment where things changed irrevocably, where they either acknowledged what was growing between them or pretended it didn't exist. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why does my safety matter so much to you?" Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, his voice low and careful, "Because somewhere between teaching you to ride and watching you become part of this town, I started caring about you, more than I should maybe, more than is wise." Eleanor's breath caught. Is it unwise to care? I don't know. He turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, his expression was open in a way she'd never seen before, vulnerable and uncertain and achingly honest. "I didn't come out here looking for this. Didn't think I'd ever want—" He stopped, started again. "After I lost my family, I told myself I was done, that I'd work my land, help my neighbors, but I wouldn't let anyone close enough to hurt me again. That was the plan. And now I'm standing on this porch trying not to tell you that you've become the most important part of my day." The words came out rushed, like he had to say them quickly or not at all. "That I look forward to Sundays like a boy looks forward to Christmas. That when I saw that storm coming, my first thought wasn't my cattle or my ranch. It was you alone at the schoolhouse, possibly in danger. And I knew I'd ride through hell itself if it meant getting to you in time." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the honesty in his confession. "Caleb, You don't have to say anything." He straightened, pulling back slightly. "I know I'm not what you expected out here. I'm just a rancher with dirt under his nails and a past full of loss. You're educated, refined, meant for better things than—" "Stop." Eleanor cut him off firmly. "Don't you dare tell me what I'm meant for. I left Philadelphia precisely because people kept telling me what I was meant for, and none of it felt right. But this—" She gestured at the snow, the town, the vast territory beyond. "Being here, teaching, learning to survive and build something of my own, this feels right. And you—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You feel right." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. "Eleanor, I care about you too," she said, rushing now, needing to say it before courage failed her. "I have for weeks, maybe months. I kept trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or that I was lonely and latching on to the first kind person I met. But yesterday, when I thought I might die in that storm, you were the person I thought about, the person I regretted not being honest with." She took a shaky breath. "So I'm being honest now. I care about you, Caleb Ward, deeply, and I don't know what that means or where it leads, but I'm tired of pretending otherwise." The silence that followed felt eternal. Caleb stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he'd forgotten he understood, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand, His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold, and his fingers curled around hers with gentle certainty. "I'd like to court you properly," he said quietly. "If you're willing. Not secret or hurried, but honest. Let people know my intentions, let you decide if this is what you want without pressure or assumptions." Eleanor's heart felt too large for her chest. "What are your intentions?" "To spend time with you. To learn everything about you, what makes you laugh, what scares you, what you dream about when you're not teaching. To show you my ranch, my life, and see if maybe there's space in it for you." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "And if you decide there is to ask you to stay, not as a teacher passing through, but as someone who belongs here, with me." Eleanor squeezed his hand, tears spilling over despite her efforts to contain them. "Yes, yes to all of it." Caleb's smile was slow and brilliant, transforming his face into something she'd remember forever. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned it made her heart ache. "Then we'll do this right," he said, "starting with me asking Mrs. Peterson's permission to call on you formally." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "You just saved my life. I think that earns you some privileges." "Maybe, but I want to do this properly anyway. You deserve proper courting, Eleanor Hayes, and I intend to give it to you." They stood together in the cold hands' clasped breath, mingling in the frozen air, and Eleanor felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of rightness that had been missing her entire life. This was where she belonged, not in Philadelphia drawing rooms or at society gatherings, but here on a snowy porch in Wyoming, holding hands with a cowboy who'd ridden through a blizzard to save her. "We should go inside," Caleb said finally, though he didn't move, "before we freeze." "In a minute." Eleanor didn't want to break the spell of this moment, this crystalline perfection. "I just want to remember this, how it feels to be completely certain about something." "What are you certain about?" She looked up at him at the face she'd come to know better than her own and smiled. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." They went inside eventually, cold and flushed and unable to stop smiling. Mrs. Peterson took one look at their clasped hands, and her expression turned knowing and pleased. "Well," she said, "I suppose the storm brought some good after all." That night, Eleanor lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, but this time she wasn't afraid. The storm could rage all it wanted. She was safe and warm and loved, or beginning to be loved, which was perhaps the same thing. Tomorrow, Caleb would ride back to his ranch. They'd face the practical questions of courtship and propriety, of balancing her teaching duties with time spent together, of navigating the curious eyes of a small town that would watch their every move with interest and speculation. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight she simply held close the memory of his hand in hers, his voice saying he cared, his eyes reflecting moonlight and hope and the promise of something beautiful growing between them. Eleanor touched her mother's locket and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for giving me the courage to come here, for giving me the chance to find this." Then she slept deeply and peacefully, while the storm exhausted itself against the indifferent strength of the Wyoming night. Morning broke clear and cold, the storm's fury replaced by stillness so complete it felt holy. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through ice crystal windows, transforming her room into something out of a fairy tale, and for a moment she wondered if the previous night had been a dream. But then she remembered the weight of Caleb's hand in hers, the roughness of his voice saying he cared, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that it had been real. Downstairs she found him already dressed and drinking coffee with Mrs. Peterson, discussing the conditions of the roads and whether the pass to his ranch would be navigable. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and something shifted in his expression, a softness, a warmth that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been hidden until now. "Morning," he said, and the single word carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Good morning." Eleanor accepted the coffee Mrs. Peterson poured for her, intensely aware of Caleb's presence across the table. Of the way, Mrs. Peterson watched them both with barely concealed satisfaction. "I'll be heading back to my ranch after breakfast," Caleb said, his tone measured, but his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "But first, Mrs. Peterson, I'd like your permission to call on Miss Hayes formally." To court her properly with your blessing and supervision. Mrs. Peterson set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, though her eyes sparkled with pleasure. Well now, that's a serious request, Mr. Ward. Yes, ma'am, it is. I don't make it lightly. And you, Eleanor, is this what you want? Mrs. Peterson's voice was kind but searching, making sure this wasn't pressure or obligation speaking. Eleanor met Caleb's gaze across the table, saw the vulnerability there despite his careful composure, and felt her heart expand with certainty. Yes, it's what I want. Then you have my blessing, Mrs. Peterson said firmly, with the understanding that Eleanor is under my care and protection, and I expect nothing but respectful, proper behavior from both of you. You have my word, Caleb replied solemnly. Good. Then I suppose we'll be seeing more of you around here, Caleb Ward. Mrs. Peterson stood and began clearing dishes, but Eleanor caught the smile she was trying to hide. Now, eat your breakfast before it gets cold. The both of you look like you're about to float away on sentiment alone. The meal passed in conversation that tried for normalcy but kept snagging on meaningful glances and half-finished sentences. Thomas appeared and monopolized Caleb's attention with questions about the storm and whether the creek would freeze solid, giving Eleanor time to collect herself and remember how to breathe normally. When Caleb finally prepared to leave saddling Copper in the cleared space behind the boarding house, Eleanor walked out with him despite the cold. The world was transformed by snow, familiar landmarks rendered strange and beautiful, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. I'll be back Sunday, Caleb said as he checked Copper's girth. After church, if that suits you. We could take a walk, let people see us together properly. I'd like that. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter against the wind. Will there be gossip, do you think? Undoubtedly. His smile was slight but genuine. Small towns live on gossip, but it'll be kind gossip mostly. People like you, Eleanor, and they'll be happy to see me courting someone. Mrs. Chen's been trying to matchmake me for 2 years now. Has she? Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter of jealousy. With whom? Every unmarried woman within 50 miles. Caleb's expression turned wry. But I wasn't interested, not until a certain stubborn teacher from Philadelphia showed up and turned my carefully ordered life upside down. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. I didn't mean to turn anything upside down. I know. That's part of why it worked. He gathered Copper's reins, then paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I'm not a man who does things halfway. When I commit to something, I see it through. And I'm committing to this to us with everything I have. But that means I need to know you're certain, that this isn't just gratitude or loneliness or some romantic notion about frontier life. The question deserved honesty, deserved more than easy reassurance. Eleanor took a moment to examine her own heart to separate genuine feeling from circumstance and emotion. I won't pretend I'm not still figuring things out, she said finally, or that everything is simple and clear. But what I feel for you isn't gratitude, Caleb. It's not obligation or fantasy. She struggled for words adequate to the feeling. It's recognition. Like I've been searching for something without knowing what it was, and then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense. Does that sound foolish? No. His voice was rough. It sounds exactly right. He mounted Copper in one smooth motion, then looked down at her with an expression so tender it made her throat tight. I'll see you Sunday, Eleanor Hayes. Try not to get caught in any more blizzards between now and then. I'll do my best. She stepped back as he wheeled Copper toward the road. Caleb, be careful going home. Always am. But he smiled as he said it, and she watched him ride away until he disappeared over the rise, a dark figure against impossible white, heading back to a ranch she'd never seen, but could somehow picture solid, well-built a place carved from wilderness through sheer determination. The rest of the day passed in a haze of domesticity and speculation. Sarah Cartwright appeared mid-morning with fresh bread and eyes bright with curiosity, followed shortly by Mary Chen with an offer to help clear snow and questions that weren't quite questions. Eleanor fielded their gentle interrogation with as much grace as she could muster, confirming that yes, Caleb had asked to court her, and yes, she had said yes and no, she didn't know exactly what the future held, but she was willing to find out. I'm happy for you, Sarah said sincerely, squeezing Eleanor's hand. Caleb's a good man, and you've brought something back to life in him. We've all seen it." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked. "He was so closed off when he first came here," Mary explained, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Polite, helpful, but distant, like he was afraid to let anyone matter to him. But this summer teaching you to ride, spending time with you, he started smiling again, started joining conversations instead of just listening from the edges. You did that." The observation settled warmly in Eleanor's chest. She'd changed his life the same way he'd changed hers, through small accumulations of trust and time, through the simple act of showing up and being present. School resumed Monday to the excitement of children who'd been trapped indoors during the storm and were now bursting with energy. Eleanor let them burn off restlessness with extra recess time, then settled them with stories about winter survival that carried practical lessons wrapped in adventure. Jack Sullivan listened with unusual attention, asking sharp questions about reading weather signs and building emergency shelters. "My pa used to say winter was when Wyoming showed whether you were smart or just lucky," he said during discussion. "Said lucky runs out, but smart keeps you alive." "Your father was wise," Eleanor replied. "What else did he teach you about surviving winter?" Jack's expression softened slightly, the defensive walls lowering as he talked about his father's knowledge of the land, the skills passed down that he was now responsible for teaching his younger brothers. Eleanor listened and made mental notes, understanding that this boy carried burdens too heavy for 14-year-old shoulders, and that sometimes teaching meant creating space for students to share their own expertise. The week passed with the particular intensity that comes from anticipation time, moving both too slowly and too quickly, every moment tinged with awareness that Sunday was coming. Eleanor caught herself daydreaming during lesson planning, imagining what it would be like to walk through town with Caleb, to be seen together openly as a couple courting. The thought brought equal parts excitement and nervousness. Friday's spelling bee became raucous and competitive, with Emma Cartwright and Thomas Peterson battling through increasingly difficult words until Thomas finally stumbled on melancholy and Emma claimed victory with quiet grace. Afterward, as Eleanor dismissed class, Emma lingered behind. "Miss Hayes, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Emma." The girl twisted her fingers together, shy in a way she usually wasn't. "Is it true you're going to marry Mr. Ward?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Where did you hear that?" "Mama said you're courting, and Sarah Miller's mama said that means you'll probably get married because that's what courting is for." Emma looked up with earnest curiosity. "So is it true?" "Emma, courting means we're getting to know each other better, to see if we'd be happy together. Marriage is a possibility, but it's not decided yet." Eleanor knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. "Does that bother you if your teacher were to marry?" "No." Emma's answer was immediate. "I think it's romantic, like in the stories you read us. And Mr. Ward is nice. He helped Papa fix our barn last summer and didn't ask for anything, just said neighbors help neighbors. Papa says that's the mark of a good man." "Your papa's right," Eleanor smiled. "Thank you for telling me that." Emma ran off to catch up with her friends, and Eleanor stood alone in the schoolhouse, feeling the weight of the community's eyes and expectations. In Philadelphia, courtship had been conducted in drawing rooms, and at formal socials insulated from public scrutiny by layers of propriety and privacy. Here in Promise Creek, her life was everyone's business, her choices observed and discussed and woven into the town's ongoing narrative. She should have found it invasive, suffocating. Instead, oddly, it felt like belonging. Sunday arrived with crisp autumn sunshine and Eleanor's best dress. The dark green wool she'd worn that first church service, which now felt like a lifetime ago. She pinned her hair with extra care and caught Mrs. Peterson watching her with maternal approval. "You look lovely, dear. Nervous." "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "Good. That means it matters." Mrs. Peterson adjusted Eleanor's collar with gentle hands. "Just remember, Caleb's probably just as nervous as you are. Men don't show it the same way, but they feel it." Church was an exercise in maintaining composure while being intensely aware of Caleb sitting 3 rows back. Eleanor stumbled twice during hymns, losing her place in the verses, and nearly dropped her prayer book. After the service, as the congregation gathered outside in the golden sunshine, she saw him making his way through the crowd toward her, and her heart began hammering against her ribs. He dressed carefully, clean shirt, pressed trousers, hair still damp from washing. He held his hat in his hands, and his expression was serious as he stopped in front of her, perfectly aware that half the town was watching. "Miss Hayes," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of taking a walk with me this afternoon?" Eleanor felt laughter bubble up at the careful propriety of it, the way he was doing this exactly right for public consumption. "I would be delighted, Mr. Ward." They walked toward the creek trail, maintaining a respectable distance between them, acutely conscious of curious eyes following their progress. Only when they'd moved beyond easy viewing distance did Caleb release a breath and glance at her with a rueful smile. "That was nerve-wracking. You did beautifully." Eleanor allowed herself to move slightly closer, their shoulders nearly brushing. "Very proper and formal." Mrs. Peterson insisted on proper. Said if I was going to court the town's teacher, I'd better do it in a way that didn't scandalize anyone. He paused. "Though I suspect the scandal ship sailed when I carried you into the boarding house half frozen, and we both spent the night under the same roof. That was a medical emergency, not impropriety. I know, and so does everyone else rationally, but that doesn't stop the speculation." He steered them toward a fallen log that made a natural bench overlooking the creek. "We should probably talk about that, about how this courtship will look, what people will expect." They sat close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool air. The creek burbled past, running high with snowmelt, and cottonwoods whispered overhead in shades of gold and amber. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked. "From this courtship, I mean. What does proper look like to you?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "I want to spend time with you. Real time, not just Sunday afternoon walks where we're both performing for the town. I want you to see my ranch, understand my life, see if you could build a future there. And I want to know you the parts you don't show in polite conversation. Your fears, your dreams, what makes you angry or sad or so happy you can't contain it." The honesty in his words made Eleanor's chest ache. "I want that too, all of it. But we have to balance that with propriety," Caleb continued. "You're the teacher. You're held to a higher standard, and I won't do anything that compromises your position, which means we're careful. We're chaperoned when appropriate. We move slowly enough that people can see my intentions are honorable." "And your intentions are—" He turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his gray eyes stole her breath. "To marry you, Eleanor. Eventually. When you're ready, when you're certain, when we've built something strong enough to last." He paused, then added with devastating simplicity, "I'm already certain, but I know you need time, need to be sure this is what you want, so I'm willing to wait, to do this right." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Is it?" He looked genuinely surprised. "I was trying to be practical." "It's both." She reached out and took his hand, no longer caring if anyone saw. "And yes, yes to all of it. To time and certainty and doing this right, to eventually." They sat together in the autumn sunshine, hands clasped, watching the creek run its ancient path through changing seasons. After a while, Caleb began talking about his ranch, describing the land and the house he'd built, the cattle operation. He was trying to grow, the challenges and satisfactions of the work. "It's not easy," he said honestly. "Some years I barely break even. Drought, disease, market prices, there's 100 ways to fail at ranching. But when it works, when you see calves healthy and strong, when the grass is good and the weather holds, there's nothing like it. Building something from nothing, making the land provide, knowing you're part of a cycle that's been going on forever." "Tell me about the house," Eleanor prompted. "What's it like?" His expression turned almost shy. "It's not fancy. 2 rooms now, though. I designed it to add on eventually. Kitchen and main room downstairs, sleeping loft above. Stone fireplace I built myself, took me 3 months of trial and error. Windows facing east and south for light and warmth. It's solid anyway, built to last." "Built with the future in mind," Eleanor said softly, remembering something Sarah had mentioned weeks ago. "Yes." He met her eyes. "Built hoping someday there'd be a reason to add those extra rooms. A family maybe. Children. a wife who'd make it a home instead of just a place to sleep between work. The picture he painted settled into Eleanor's imagination, a stone fireplace. Morning light, through east windows, the sound of children's laughter mixing with the lowing of cattle. It should have terrified her, this vision so different from anything she'd imagined for herself. Instead, it felt like coming home. "I'd like to see it," she said. "Your ranch, the house you built. Next Sunday I'll bring the wagon, make sure we're properly chaperoned. Mrs. Peterson or Sarah can come along if they're willing." He squeezed her hand gently. "I want you to see it, Eleanor. See if you can imagine yourself there." They talked until the afternoon light began to slant toward evening about everything and nothing, building the foundation of knowledge that would support whatever future they might build together. Eleanor told him about her childhood, her mother's quiet strength and her father's intellectual distance, the marriage that had pushed her west. Caleb shared memories of Missouri before the war of family lost and lessons learned through grief of choosing to start over in a place where his past didn't define him. When they finally walked back toward town, Eleanor felt changed in some fundamental way, more herself than she'd ever been, more certain of what she wanted, even as the specifics remained uncertain. At the boarding house door, Caleb took both her hands in his and looked at her with such tenderness it made her throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance, for being brave enough to try. Thank you for being patient with me, for seeing something worth courting in a stubborn teacher from Philadelphia." His smile was slow and beautiful. "I see everything worth courting, Eleanor Hayes, and I intend to spend every Sunday proving it to you." He left before the impulse to kiss her could overcome propriety, and Eleanor went inside to find Mrs. Peterson and Sarah and Mary waiting with tea and barely restrained curiosity. She let them fuss over her, answered their questions with as much detail as felt private, and absorbed their genuine happiness on her behalf. That night, writing a letter to her father, Eleanor tried to find words to explain what was happening in her life. The courtship, the man, the unexpected way her heart had opened to possibilities she'd never considered. She wrote and rewrote, trying to convey that she was happy, that she'd found something precious in this harsh, beautiful territory, that she was exactly where she needed to be. The following week established a new rhythm. Eleanor taught during the week, pouring energy into her students and lesson plans. Evenings were for preparation and socializing for chess games with Mrs. Peterson and Thomas, for helping Sarah with sewing or learning Chinese cooking techniques from Mary. Caleb came to town twice during the week on various errands, always stopping by to check on her conversations, brief but weighted with meaning. And then Sunday came again, bringing the promised trip to Caleb's ranch. Sarah agreed to come as chaperone, curious herself to see what Caleb had built. They set out mid-morning in Caleb's wagon, following the creek trail south until it diverged toward open rangeland. The landscape transformed as they traveled, becoming wilder, emptier, beautiful in its vastness. Eleanor saw cattle grazing in the distance, their brands too far away to read, and Caleb pointed out property boundaries and water sources with the detailed knowledge of someone who'd walked every inch of his land. "That's the Circle W," he said, indicating a cluster of buildings visible against the foothills. "Home." As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out details. A solid house built of logs and stone, a barn, and several outbuildings arranged with practical efficiency fences in good repair, everything speaking of care and hard work. Smoke drifted from the chimney where someone was keeping a fire going, and a dog barked enthusiastically at their approach. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up, lean and weathered, maybe 50, with shrewd eyes and a rifle held casually in one hand. "Tom," Caleb called. "We're friendly." "Figured." The man Tom Bradshaw, Eleanor guessed, lowered the rifle and approached with a slight limp. "Brought company, I see." "This is Miss Eleanor Hayes and Mrs. Sarah Cartwright. Ladies, Tom Bradshaw, my hired man, and the reason this place functions when I'm not here." Tom nodded politely, his eyes sharp and assessing as he looked at Eleanor. "Heard about you, the teacher." "Guilty as charged." Eleanor smiled despite her nervousness. Tom's expression gave nothing away. "Well, any friend of Caleb's is welcome here. I'll be in the barn if you need me. Got a mare foaling soon that I'm keeping an eye on." He disappeared back into the barn, and Caleb helped Eleanor and Sarah down from the wagon. "Don't mind Tom. He's suspicious of everyone until he decides they're trustworthy. Saved my life my first winter here when I didn't know enough to properly winterize the barn. He'll warm up eventually. The house was exactly as Caleb had described: solid, well-built, purposeful. He showed them through with an almost anxious pride, pointing out features that mattered to him. The stone fireplace with its carefully mortared rocks. The kitchen area with its good iron stove and hand-built cabinets. The windows that let in morning light, the loft ladder sturdy and well-crafted. The small details that showed this was more than just shelter. It was a home waiting to be filled. "It's wonderful," Eleanor said honestly, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table he'd built. "You made all this?" "Most of it. Tom helped with some of the heavier construction, and I traded work with neighbors for things I couldn't manage alone. But yes, it's mine, built from the ground up." He watched her explore with barely concealed anxiety. "What do you think, honestly?" Eleanor looked around at the clean space, the practical layout, the way everything spoke of competence and care. She thought about winter evenings by that fireplace, summer mornings, with light streaming through those windows, the life that could be lived within these walls. "I think it's exactly what it should be," she said finally. "A place built by someone who understands what matters. Strength, warmth, room to grow. It's perfect." The relief in Caleb's expression was palpable. Sarah, who'd been tactfully examining the view from the window, turned with a knowing smile. "It's a good house, Caleb. You should be proud." They spent the afternoon exploring the property with Caleb pointing out his plans for expansion, where he wanted to add another paddock, where the vegetable garden would go when he had time to plant one properly, where additional rooms could be added to the house when needed. He introduced them to his cattle, explaining bloodlines and breeding plans with the enthusiasm of someone who truly loved the work. Tom emerged from the barn to announce the mare had successfully foaled a healthy colt, already trying to stand on wobbly legs. Eleanor and Sarah watched from the stall door as Caleb examined the newborn with gentle, knowledgeable hands, checking for problems, ensuring both mother and baby were healthy. "You're good at this," Eleanor observed. "Had to learn. Can't run cattle without understanding how they work, what they need." He straightened, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Every year I learn something new. Every year gets a little easier." On the ride back to town with Sarah dozing in the wagon bed and twilight painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Caleb drove with one hand and held Eleanor's with the other, a simple intimacy that felt profound in its naturalness. "Could you see it?" he asked quietly. "Living there, I mean. Could you imagine it?" Eleanor thought about the solid house, the land stretching toward mountains, the life Caleb was building with determination and hope. She thought about teaching during the day and coming home to that fireplace at night, about seasons changing and a future unfolding in that beautiful, harsh territory. "Yes," she said simply. "I could see it." His hand tightened on hers, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, while the first stars appeared overhead, and the future stretched before them, unknown, but no longer frightening. The weeks that followed took on a quality that Eleanor would later remember as golden, though whether that was the autumn light or the glow of happiness coloring her memory, she could never quite decide. The courtship progressed with the careful deliberation of two people who understood that what they were building needed a solid foundation, that rushing would serve neither of them well. Caleb came to town every Sunday without fail, and they walked or rode together, always chaperoned, always proper, but with an ease between them that grew more natural with each passing week. They played chess in Mrs. Peterson's parlor, while Thomas watched and learned strategy. They attended church socials where the town observed their courtship with benevolent interest. They talked about everything from philosophy to cattle breeding, discovering that their minds matched as well as their hearts. Eleanor's teaching flourished. Her students had settled into routines, and she'd learned to read them the way Caleb read weather, knowing when Jack Sullivan's surliness meant trouble at home that needed gentle inquiry, when Emma Cartwright's unusual quietness signaled she was working through a difficult concept rather than struggling. The schoolhouse had become her domain, a place where she felt competent and necessary and deeply fulfilled. But as October deepened toward November, Eleanor began to sense something shifting in Caleb. He grew quieter during their Sunday visits, more contemplative, as if wrestling with some decision he hadn't yet voiced. She didn't push, trusting that whatever it was would emerge when he was ready, But the waiting created a peculiar tension that hummed beneath their conversations. The answer came on a Sunday in mid-November after church, when instead of their usual walk, Caleb asked if she'd ride out to his ranch again. "Just you and me this time," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. "I know it's not entirely proper, but I need to talk to you somewhere private, somewhere we won't be observed." Mrs. Peterson, when consulted, studied them both with shrewd eyes before nodding. "I trust you both to behave with honor, and I suspect what Caleb needs to say is best said without an audience. But Eleanor, you're back before dark, understood?" "Yes, ma'am," they answered in unison, and Mrs. Peterson's smile suggested she knew exactly what Caleb intended. They rode in Caleb's wagon through landscape transformed by approaching winter. The cottonwoods had lost most of their leaves, and the prairie grass had faded to gold and brown, but the sky was brilliant blue, and the air carried that particular crystalline quality that came before the first serious snow. Eleanor sat close to Caleb on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching through layers of wool, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. At the ranch, Caleb unhitched the horses with quick efficiency while Eleanor waited by the house watching clouds drift past distant mountains. Tom Bradshaw was nowhere in sight. Caleb had given him the day off. Eleanor realized, which meant they were truly alone. The impropriety of it should have worried her, but instead she felt only anticipation. Inside, Caleb built up the fire and put coffee on to heat, moving through the domestic tasks with the ease of someone accustomed to caring for himself. Eleanor removed her coat and stood by the fireplace, absorbing the warmth and the particular stillness of the house. It felt different without Sarah's cheerful chatter, more intimate, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice drew her attention. He stood across the room, hands shoved in his pockets, expression serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that?" "Of course." Her heart began hammering. "Are you happy here? In Promise Creek, I mean. Teaching, living at the boarding house, building this life. Is it what you wanted, or are you just making the best of circumstances?" The question surprised her. She'd expected, well, she wasn't sure what she'd expected, but not this. "I'm happy," she said slowly, thinking it through. "More than I've ever been, actually." "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know if you're settling." He crossed to stand before her, his eyes searching her face with uncomfortable intensity. "If you're here because you have nowhere else to go, or because Philadelphia didn't work out, or because you're grateful to me for helping you, I need to know if this is truly what you want, or just what's available." Eleanor felt a flash of something like anger that he could doubt after all these months. But beneath it, she recognized the fear driving his questions, the same fear she sometimes felt late at night, wondering if this happiness was too fragile to last. "I'm not settling," she said firmly, "and I'm not here out of gratitude or lack of options. I'm here because Promise Creek feels like home in a way Philadelphia never did. Because teaching these children matters more than any society accomplishment I might have achieved back east. Because—" She stopped, took a breath, made herself vulnerable. "Because you're here, and being near you makes me happier than I knew was possible." Is that honest enough? Relief flooded Caleb's expression, but he didn't move closer. "One more question then. Do you miss it? The city? The culture? The things you gave up to come here?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "I miss the library, the concerts, the sense of being connected to larger intellectual conversations. But Caleb missing something doesn't mean I regret leaving it. People are complicated. We can hold multiple truths at once. I can appreciate what Philadelphia offered while knowing it wasn't the right place for me. Does that make sense?" "Yes." He finally moved closer, taking her hands in his. "It makes perfect sense. I just needed to hear you say it, needed to be sure you wouldn't wake up one day and resent the life you'd chosen. Resent me for being part of that choice." "I could never resent you." Eleanor squeezed his hands. "But Caleb, what's this really about? Why these questions now?" He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, and when his hand emerged, it held a small velvet box that made Eleanor's breath catch. He didn't open it, just held it, looking at her with such raw hope and vulnerability that her eyes burned with tears. This is about me wanting to ask you to marry me, but needing to be certain first. Needing to know that I'm not asking you to give up dreams or settle for less than you deserve." His voice was steady, despite the emotion roughening it. "You've only been here 8 months, Eleanor. That's not very long to make a decision that will shape the rest of your life. So before I ask, I need to know, are you certain? Not about me necessarily, but about this life. About Wyoming and teaching and the hardships that come with frontier living. Because once you say yes, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. But I can't protect you from the reality of what this territory demands." Eleanor felt tears spill over, but she was smiling through them. "You're asking if I'm sure before you ask me to marry you?" "Yes." He looked almost embarrassed. "I know it's backward, but it's perfect." She pulled one hand free to cup his face, feeling the roughness of stubble against her palm. "And yes, I'm certain. I'm certain about this life, about Promise Creek, about building something meaningful here. I'm certain that teaching matters and that these children need me. I'm certain that winter will be hard and that there will be days I struggle and moments I'm homesick for things I left behind. But I'm also certain," her voice dropped to a whisper, "that I love you, Caleb Ward, that I have for months, even when I was trying to convince myself it was too soon or too impractical or too risky. I love you, and I want to build a life with you, and I'm as certain about that as I've ever been about anything." The expression that transformed his face was worth every moment of vulnerability, every risk she'd taken. He opened the box with hands that shook slightly, revealing a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the firelight. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I saved from Missouri. I've been carrying it for weeks waiting for the right moment, but I kept talking myself out of asking because 8 months felt too soon because I was afraid you'd say yes out of obligation or pressure." He looked up from the ring to meet her eyes. "But I can't wait anymore. Eleanor Hayes, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, share my home, help me build the future I've been dreaming of since the night I found you beside that trunk, too proud to cry and too stubborn to give up?" Eleanor was crying now in earnest tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with reverent care, and it fit perfectly as if it had been waiting all along for her hand. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her close, his face buried in her hair, his whole body trembling with relief and happiness. "Thank God," he murmured. "I was so afraid you'd ask for more time, that you'd be sensible and practical and say, we should wait until spring at least." Eleanor pulled back enough to look at him. "Would you have waited as long as you needed? But I'm glad I don't have to." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. "Eleanor, I promise you won't regret this. I'll spend every day proving you made the right choice." "I know I have." She rose on her toes and kissed him, a brief, sweet press of lips that carried the weight of promise and commitment. It was her first kiss, and it felt exactly right, tender and careful and full of restrained passion that spoke of patience and respect. When they pulled apart, both breathless Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably head back to town before Mrs. Peterson sends out a search party, and we need to start planning. There's a lot to figure out." "Like when?" Eleanor asked, practical concerns beginning to surface through the haze of joy. "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, next month, next spring. Though I'd be lying if I said I wanted to wait long." He smiled. "I've spent 3 years alone in this house, Eleanor. Now that I know you'll be sharing it every day without you feels like wasted time." They discussed possibilities as they rode back to town through the late afternoon light. A winter wedding would be small but intimate before the worst weather hit. Spring would allow for more preparation, give Eleanor time to finish the school year properly. They debated advantages and complications, trying to balance practical concerns with the simple desire to begin their married life together. By the time they reached the boarding house, they'd tentatively settled on February after the worst of winter. But before spring, planting demanded all of Caleb's attention. 3 months to prepare to ensure Eleanor could train her replacement to allow the town time to adjust to the change. Mrs. Peterson took one look at Eleanor's hand and let out a whoop of joy that brought Thomas running from the kitchen. Within an hour, half the town knew. By evening, everyone knew. Sarah and Mary arrived bearing congratulations and immediately began planning celebrations. Doc Morrison stopped by to shake Caleb's hand and tell Eleanor she'd chosen well. Even Tom Bradshaw rode in from the ranch to offer gruff approval and a promise to help build whatever additions to the house the newlyweds might need. That night, Eleanor sat at her writing desk with a lamp casting golden light over fresh paper, composing a letter to her father. She'd written regularly since arriving in Wyoming, but those letters had been carefully neutral, designed to reassure without revealing too much. This letter was different. She told him about Caleb, his character, his work, the life he'd built from nothing. She described the proposal and her certainty, trying to convey that this wasn't recklessness or desperation, but a considered choice made by a woman who knew her own heart. She invited him to the wedding, though the distance and winter weather made attendance unlikely, and she promised that he'd be welcome in her new home whenever he could visit. Writing it, Eleanor felt the last threads connecting her to her old life begin to transform, not breaking exactly, but shifting into something different. Her father would always be her father. Philadelphia would always be where she came from, but they no longer defined her future. She was creating something new, something wholly her own, and the freedom in that realization was dizzying. The weeks before Christmas passed in a flurry of preparation. Eleanor continued teaching while also beginning to train Sarah, who'd agreed to take over the school after the wedding. Sarah was a natural teacher, patient and creative, and the children responded well to her. Eleanor felt confident the school would be in good hands, though saying goodbye to her students would be harder than she'd anticipated. She and Caleb spent every possible moment together, often accompanied by Mrs. Peterson or Sarah, but occasionally managing stolen minutes alone. They planned their wedding, a simple ceremony in the church, followed by a celebration at the boarding house. They discussed their future. Eleanor would continue teaching through January, then focus on preparing for married life. Caleb was building an addition to the house, 2 extra rooms that would give them more space, and eventually room for children. The word children had come up naturally in conversation, and Eleanor had been surprised by her own enthusiasm for the prospect. In Philadelphia, motherhood had seemed like an obligation, something expected rather than desired. But the thought of raising children with Caleb, teaching them about the world, while Caleb taught them about the land, filled her with anticipation rather than anxiety. Winter settled in with serious purpose in early December. The first major snowfall trapped them all indoors for 3 days, and Eleanor used the time to work on her wedding dress, simple ivory wool that Mrs. Peterson was helping her sew. They worked by the fire while Thomas read aloud from adventure novels, and Eleanor felt a contentment so profound it frightened her. This was happiness, she realized. Not the dramatic sweep you off your feet emotion she'd read about in novels, but something quieter and deeper. The satisfaction of meaningful work, the warmth of community, the anticipation of a future with someone who understood and valued her. Christmas brought unexpected joy in the form of a letter from her father. He wrote that he couldn't attend the wedding. The journey was too difficult in winter and his health wasn't what it used to be, but he gave his blessing and his approval of her choice. More surprising, he admitted that her stepmother had finally confessed to making Eleanor's life deliberately difficult in hopes she'd leave, and that he was ashamed he hadn't seen it sooner. He asked for forgiveness and promised to visit in the spring to meet his new son-in-law and see the life his daughter had built. Eleanor cried over the letter, then showed it to Caleb, who held her while she processed the complicated mix of vindication and grief and relief. "He'll come around completely," Caleb promised. "And if he doesn't, you have a family here who loves you. You have me." The week after Christmas, Caleb brought Eleanor to the ranch to see the completed addition. He'd worked tirelessly despite the cold, and Tom had helped, and now the house had 2 additional rooms, a proper bedroom for them, and another room that could serve as whatever they needed. A study for Eleanor to continue reading and learning, a nursery eventually. Eleanor walked through the new space, running her hands along the smooth wood, imagining curtains at the windows and furniture she'd choose with Caleb. The bedroom had a large window facing east so they'd wake with the sunrise, and Caleb had built shelves into one wall for her books. "It's perfect," she said, turning to find him watching her with barely concealed anxiety. "Caleb, it's absolutely perfect." His relief was palpable. "You're sure if you want anything changed?" "I don't want anything changed. I want to move in immediately and start our life together." She crossed to him, sliding her arms around his waist. I want to wake up in that room with you beside me. I want to cook in that kitchen and read by that fireplace and fill this house with love and laughter and all the things that make a place a home." He kissed her then longer and deeper than their previous careful kisses, and Eleanor felt heat bloom through her body in ways that were both exciting and slightly frightening. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb's expression was rueful. "We should probably get you back to town before I forget every promise I made about proper behavior." Eleanor laughed breathlessly. "Probably wise, though for the record I find your lack of perfect control very flattering." "Just wait until we're married," he said, voice rough with promise. "Then I'll show you exactly how much control I've been exercising." The ride back to town was charged with new awareness, with the knowledge that in just a few weeks they'd be married, that all the careful restraint would finally be unnecessary. Eleanor leaned against Caleb's shoulder and watched the winter landscape slide past, counting down days until February. January brought bitter cold and the last weeks of Eleanor's teaching career. She'd decided to finish the month giving Sarah a full week to transition before Eleanor's last day. The children sensed change coming and grew clingy, especially the younger ones who'd known no other teacher. Emma Cartwright cried openly when Eleanor announced she'd be leaving after the wedding, and even Jack Sullivan looked troubled, though he tried to hide it behind his usual gruffness. "You'll still be in town, though, right?" he asked after class one day. "At Mr. Ward's ranch. That's not so far." "Not far at all," Eleanor assured him. "And you're always welcome to visit if you need help with lessons or just want to talk. Being married doesn't mean I stop caring about you all." "Will you have children?" Emma asked. "Your own children to teach." "Someday, perhaps." "Would that bother you?" Emma considered this seriously. "No. I think you'd be a good mother. You're patient but firm, and you always explain things so they make sense. That's what mothers should do." The observation delivered with childlike honesty made Eleanor's throat tight. These children had become hers in ways she hadn't anticipated, and leaving them felt like tearing away part of herself. But she trusted Sarah, and she knew her own capacity for love wasn't limited. She could love her students and her future children, her teaching career and her marriage without any diminishing the other. Her last day of teaching arrived with unexpected snow-delicate flakes drifting past the schoolhouse windows as Eleanor conducted final lessons. She'd prepared a special geography session about Philadelphia, bringing in photographs and maps, wanting to share her past with these children who'd become her present. They listened with rapt attention as she described her childhood, asking questions that showed genuine interest in understanding where their teacher came from. At the end of the day, the students surprised her with a gift, a quilt they'd all worked on in secret with Sarah's help. Each child had contributed a square, decorated with drawings or embroidered messages, and Sarah had sewn them together into something beautiful and deeply personal. Eleanor held the quilt and wept openly, abandoning all pretense of teacher dignity, and her students clustered around her with hugs and promises to visit, and insistence that she'd always be their teacher, even if Sarah was teaching them now. Caleb arrived to drive her home and found her still surrounded by children, all of them reluctant to let go. He waited patiently until they'd all said their goodbyes, then helped Eleanor gather her personal belongings from the schoolhouse for the last time. "You made a difference here," he said quietly as they walked to the wagon. "Those children won't forget you." "I hope not." Eleanor clutched the quilt to her chest. "I won't forget them either. They changed me as much as I changed them." The week before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. Eleanor's dress was finished simple but beautiful with lace at the collar that Mrs. Peterson had tatted by hand. The church had been cleaned and decorated by the women of the town, and Mrs. Peterson had coordinated a celebration dinner that would feed everyone. Eleanor's few possessions had been gradually transported to the ranch. Her books already on the shelves Caleb had built. Her clothes hanging in the wardrobe he'd bought in Cheyenne. 3 days before the wedding, Eleanor's father surprised everyone by arriving on the stagecoach bundled against the cold and looking older than she remembered, but smiling genuinely. He'd received her Christmas letter and decided he couldn't miss his daughter's wedding health and weather be damned. Eleanor introduced him to Caleb with her heart in her throat, watching as the two most important men in her life sized each other up. Her father asked questions about the ranch, about Caleb's plans for the future, about how he intended to provide for Eleanor. Caleb answered with quiet confidence, neither defensive nor boastful, simply honest about his life and his love for Eleanor. After an hour of conversation, her father turned to Eleanor and said, "You chose well, daughter. This is a good man." That evening, walking through the snowy streets with both her father and her fiancé, Eleanor felt the last piece of her old and new lives click into place. Her father's approval meant more than she'd realized, and having him here to witness her marriage felt like a gift she hadn't dared hope for. The night before the wedding, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed at the boarding house, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, knowing it was her last night as Eleanor Hayes' unmarried teacher from Philadelphia. Tomorrow she'd become Eleanor Ward wife and partner, and the beginning of something entirely new. She wasn't nervous exactly. She was ready. But the magnitude of the choice, the permanence of the commitment deserved acknowledgement. She was choosing this life, this man, this future, and whatever challenges came would be hers to face. Eleanor touched her mother's locket, as she had every night since arriving in Wyoming, and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Mama, for teaching me to be brave, for showing me that love is about partnership and respect, not just duty or obligation. I wish you could be here tomorrow, but I feel you with me. I hope I make you proud." Morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that was beautiful, despite its harshness. Eleanor dressed with Mrs. Peterson's help, the ivory wool dress, transforming her into something that felt almost otherworldly. Her father presented her with a cameo that had belonged to her grandmother, pinning it at her throat with trembling hands. "You look so much like your mother," he said, voice thick with emotion. She would have loved to see this, loved to know you'd found such happiness. The church was packed when they arrived, the entire town having turned out despite the cold. Eleanor saw her students in the front rows with their families, saw Sarah and Mary and all the women who'd become her friends, saw Tom Bradshaw cleaned up and uncomfortable in a suit, saw Doc Morrison and the Sullivan family, and everyone who'd made Promise Creek feel like home. And at the front of the church, waiting beside the minister, stood Caleb. He'd bought a new suit for the occasion, dark and well-fitted, and he'd gotten his hair cut, but it was his expression that caught her breath. He looked at her with such open love and wonder that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. This was real. This was happening. This man loved her, and she loved him, and they were about to promise their lives to each other. Her father walked her down the aisle with steady steps, and when they reached the front, he placed her hand in Caleb's with a gentle squeeze that said everything words couldn't. Then he stepped back, and it was just Eleanor and Caleb facing each other, about to make vows that would bind them together. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their promises in clear voices to love and honor, to support and cherish in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death parted them. Eleanor meant every word with a conviction that went soul deep, and when Caleb slipped a matching gold band onto her finger beside her grandmother's ring, she felt something fundamental shift in the universe, as if the world had been waiting for this moment to lock into its proper alignment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said with satisfied finality. "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb cupped Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her tenderly, thoroughly, with a passion tempered by awareness of their audience, but promising more in private. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and when they turned to face their community, as Mr. and Mrs. Ward, Eleanor felt joy so complete it was almost painful. They were married. They were beginning their life together, and this time when she looked toward the future, Eleanor saw not uncertainty or anxiety, but possibility and promise and the steady presence of the man beside her. The celebration at the boarding house was joyous and chaotic, with food and music and dancing that lasted into the evening. Eleanor danced with her father, with Thomas Peterson, with every man who asked, but mostly with Caleb, who held her close and whispered in her ear about how beautiful she was, how lucky he felt, how much he loved her. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Caleb leaned close and murmured, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Ward." The name sent a thrill through her. Yes, take me home. They said their goodbyes amid rice and well wishes, climbed into Caleb's wagon that Tom had decorated with ribbons, and rode toward the ranch through moonlight that turned the snow-covered landscape into something magical. Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder. Her husband, she could think that now, and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. At the ranch, Caleb lifted her from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, despite her laughing protests, setting her down gently in front of the fireplace, where flames danced in welcome. The house was warm, prepared by Tom, who'd discreetly disappeared to give them privacy, and candles glowed on the mantel, casting soft light through the space. "Welcome home," Caleb said softly, pulling her into his arms. "Our home now." Eleanor rose on her toes to kiss him, and this time there was no restraint, no audience, no need for careful control. They kissed with all the pent-up passion of months of waiting, and when Caleb lifted her again and carried her to their bedroom, Eleanor went willingly, joyfully into the life they were about to begin together. Later, lying in their bed with Caleb's arms around her and moonlight streaming through the east-facing window, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The stagecoach that had abandoned her the terrifying night alone, the stranger who'd lifted her into his wagon and ultimately into a life more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked sleepily, his voice rough and content. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Eleanor turned to face him, studying the beloved features in the moonlight. "That every difficult moment, every scared decision, every leap of faith led me to you, to this. And I wouldn't change a single thing, not even getting abandoned by that stagecoach. Especially not that." She kissed him softly. "Because it brought me to you, and you've given me everything I didn't know I needed. Home, purpose, love. A future I actually want to wake up for." Caleb gathered her closer, his hand splaying protectively across her back. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me, choosing this life." "I know you will." "But Caleb," she pulled back enough to meet his eyes, "you don't have to earn my love or prove my choice was right. You already did that just by being who you are, patient and kind and steady and strong, by seeing me as a partner, not a possession, by building this beautiful life and inviting me to share it." They talked quietly into the night, making plans and sharing dreams, discussing the life they'd build together. Children, eventually, perhaps 3 or 4. Eleanor could tutor them at home, teach them literature and history, while Caleb taught them about the land. They'd expand the ranch gradually, maybe get some sheep in addition to cattle. They'd host Sunday dinners for friends, create traditions, become the kind of family that Eleanor had always wanted, but never quite had. As Eleanor finally drifted towards sleep, warm and safe and profoundly happy, she thought about the girl who'd sat beside her trunk 8 months ago, too frightened to cry, too stubborn to give up. She barely recognized that girl now, though Eleanor knew she was still in there somewhere, woven into the woman she'd become. Wyoming had transformed her not by breaking her down, but by giving her space to grow. Promise Creek had given her purpose, community, and the chance to make a real difference. And Caleb had given her love, partnership, and the courage to build the life she'd always secretly wanted but never dared claim. She slept beside her husband in their ranch house under quilts her students had made, surrounded by books she loved and furniture they'd chosen together. And when morning came with light streaming through that east-facing window, Eleanor woke to find Caleb already awake, watching her with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Ward," he said, and the name that had seemed so foreign yesterday now felt like it had always belonged to her. "Good morning," she replied, stretching contentedly. "What shall we do with our first full day as a married couple?" "Whatever we want." Caleb pulled her close. "We have the rest of our lives to figure it out. No rush." And there wasn't a rush, Eleanor realized. They had time now, all the time in the world, to build their life together, to face challenges and celebrate victories, to grow old side by side in this harsh, beautiful territory they both loved. She'd come west looking for escape and found home instead. She'd expected hardship and found purpose. She'd been prepared for loneliness and discovered love in its truest, deepest form. The journey that had started with a cowboy lifting a frightened girl into his wagon had led here to this perfect morning, to this beautiful life, to this man who looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Eleanor Hayes Ward smiled at her husband and settled deeper into his embrace, ready to face whatever the future brought, certain only that they would face it together. And that she thought with profound contentment was more than enough. It was everything.